Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
Thank you so much. I am just giddy with all the wonderful reviews and reception that the book has received. I have waited 15 years for this moment. That is a very long time. I'm so honored and humbled to be here. I've spent so long steeped in the history of the Great Migration. For a while, I was stuck in 1947. I thought I would never get out of 1947. For the record, just to be able to clarify what it is that the book is about, the Great Migration was the biggest underreported story of the 20th century. It started in 1915 and it did not end until the 1970s. All along the way, people were thinking it must be over. End of World War I, it's done. End of World War II, it's done. But no one told the people that, so they kept coming. It carried away some 6 million African Americans to all points north and west to escape the Southern caste system known as Jim Crow in search of the warmth of other suns. It was an unrecognized immigration within the borders of our own country. It was vast, it was leaderless, it was the first step the nation's servant class ever took without asking. I've spent so many years studying this that it is so fitting that I am here in Georgia, in Atlanta, of all places, giving my first public talk about the book that has taken so much of my adult life. I came to Georgia for reasons that were unrelated to the book, and I later realized that I needed to be here. I didn't know that I needed to be here, but I did need to be here. I needed to be able to see camellias, which I thought were roses, blooming in January. I needed to see crepe myrtles in bloom that last forever. I needed to be able to see the daphnes, which smell indescribably beautiful in January. I needed to understand what the people left, to understand the great sacrifice that they made by moving to the north and west. This book was meant to be, and I could not rest until it was completed. There are many, many people who thought it would never be done. In fact, ever since this whirlwind has begun, there have been so many people who said, you know, I wondered if you ever would finish it. I hoped you would, and I believed you might, but I just wasn't certain. And so I'm so delighted and maybe more relieved than anything else to be able to stand here and say that it's done. The reviews have been just astounding, and I am so grateful for them. I'm grateful for the response. But I think I'm even more grateful that my mother is here to see this day. It is so emotional for me to be here because my roots run deep in Georgia, very deep. Deeper than most people who even live here, because you hardly ever find anybody who's actually from Atlanta. My great-grandmother, whom we believe to have been born to slaves, grew up in Marietta in Cobb County, Georgia. My grandmother grew up also in Marietta, and she was a master gardener. And when I got here to Georgia, something took over me. I could never grow anything anywhere before I got here to Georgia. I couldn't grow a hosta, which they grow like weeds everywhere else. And I got here, and something inside of me just took over. She used to grow American Beauty roses that were the size of saucers that people wanted to buy for $1 a piece back in the 30s and the 40s, which is astounding. She was a beautiful gardener. And when I got here, I had this inexplicable urge to start digging in the soil. And I have planted almost every quarter inch of my house in the Highlands as a result of this. I even can grow the most difficult things, Daphnes, which apparently people say you have to plant 5 in order to get 1, and 1 is not even planted, it's actually in a pot and is still living, which is astounding to me. So my grandmother has come through to me here, and so this is a really special spiritual place for me, and it was the only place I could have written this book, because I started the book in the North by talking to over 1,200 people. I stopped counting after 1,200 people who had migrated from the South to the North to New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. I met them there in all kinds of places. I can get into that a little bit later. And I had gotten this exile perspective of the South. I'd gotten this perspective of the hurt, aggrieved, embittered, turning one's back on the South perspective. And I needed to be here in order to be able to see what they left. And by living here, it gave me a sense of the enormity of the sacrifice that they made by leaving all that they knew, and the people and the family, the soil, the land, the plants, the things that made them Southern, to leave all of that for a place they'd never seen in hopes for something better. And it is also here in Georgia, decades before I was born, that the seeds of this book about the Great Migration were sown. And I want to tell you a little bit about that. The South was a very different place from the time when my uncle, my mother's big brother, left Georgia, the first in my immediate family or lineage to do so, in the middle of a bleak era in American history. It was the Depression, and Jim Crow was the law of the land in the South. Let me share with you exactly what that felt like and why it was a tragedy for everyone, black and white, who lived under it. These were the facts of life from the 1890s to the 1960s in the American South. It's hard to believe now, but these were the facts of their lives. And we're not talking about slavery. We are talking about a caste system that was in force during the lifetime of many Americans still alive today, during the lifetime of many people in the room with us tonight. There were days when whites could go to an amusement park and a day when blacks could go, if they were permitted at all. There were white elevators and colored elevators, meaning the freight elevators in the back right here in Atlanta. There were white ambulances and black ambulances to ferry the sick, and white hearses and black hearses for those who didn't survive whatever was wrong with them. There were white waiting rooms and colored waiting rooms in any conceivable place that a person might have to wait for something, from the bus depot to the doctor's office. An interesting story ran in the Wall Street Journal in 1958, and it described a new segregated bus station that had just gone up in Jacksonville, Florida. It had 2 of everything, including 2 segregated cocktail lounges, lest the races, as the journal said in quotes, lest the races brush elbows over a martini. There was, believe it or not, a colored window at the post office in Pensacola, Florida. And there were white and colored telephone booths in Oklahoma, a state we don't even consider to be the South, but by many respects it actually is. White people and colored people went to separate windows to get their license plates in Indianola, Mississippi, and to separate tellers to make their deposits at the First National Bank here in Atlanta. There were taxi cabs for colored people and taxi cabs for white people in Jacksonville, Birmingham, Atlanta, and the entire state of Mississippi. Colored people had to be off the streets and out of the city limits by 8 p.m. in Palm Beach and in Miami Beach. It was against the law for a colored person, and this is the hardest one for me to believe, it was against the law for a colored person and a white person to play checkers together in Birmingham. At saloons here in Atlanta, the bars were segregated. Whites drank on stools at one end of the bar and blacks on stools at the other end, until the city outlawed even that, resulting in white-only and colored-only saloons. There were white parking spaces and colored parking spaces in Calhoun, Mississippi, and in one North Carolina courthouse, there was even a white Bible and a black Bible to swear to tell the truth on. What this meant was that people who might have gotten along famously if it had not been for the color of their skin never got the chance to know one another, to truly know one another. And one of the South's greatest resources, its people, and particularly the black people whose forebears had helped build the South without pay, did not get to be their fullest selves. My mother, who grew up in Rome, Georgia, once said that there was a really nice white lady who brought laundry to my grandmother, and she used to have a wonderful time, a great time talking with my grandmother. My mother said that they got along so well that they might have been the best of friends in another time and place. But the caste system of Jim Crow meant that they both knew that they could only take it so far. They're both dead. It's too late. But what a shame and what a loss to both of them. And you think of it to millions of other people who lost out on getting to know one another. It's a lesson to all of us to not let that be a barrier, I think, now.
Context of White Supremacy. Justice Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, July 26th, 2013. So I have been told. We will be back tomorrow, compensatory call-in, Saturday evening at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, and 6 p.m. Pacific. Tune in, share. Looking forward to hearing from non-white people, victims of racism. Definitely want to continue having our weekly section that deals with what's happening on the J.O.W. If you have had triumphs, definitely want to hear that. If you have had problems, share. I'm sure there are many, many other non-white people around the world who can empathize and might even be dealing with the same trifling white racists on their job. Tune in. Looking forward to hearing from folks. Invest if you think the program is constructive. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. First study session on Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. Suggested from listeners. We did vote for the book that we were going to do this week. We ended with a tie in the voting. Warmth of Other Suns and Ayi Kwei Armah 2000 Seasons ended up tied. I went with this one because 2000 Seasons is one of my favorite books. I've already read it. It's in my top 5 with Yurugu, The ISIS Papers, 1984. I suspect we will probably hit all of the books that are in my top 5. Invisible Man. We'll probably hit all of those if white people allow us to continue broadcasting. So I'm very certain that 2000 Seasons will pop up, whether listeners selected or I selected. That will come up down the road. I went with this one because I haven't read this book yet. So I'm always down to get a new book. And I'm sure we will take care of both of these given enough time. At any rate, this will be challenging for me. I always appreciate a challenge. This will definitely challenge my counter-racist skills. The clip that you heard at the beginning, that was the author, who happens to be a gorgeous, and I mean astoundingly gorgeous, black female. It will be challenging. I've said many times before, Dr. Welsing talking about racism and understanding racism are two different things. Many people talk about racism. That does not mean that they understand racism, white supremacy. I'm not interested in having white friends. You heard the clip at the beginning, and that's one of the early lectures that the victim of racism, Isabel Wilkerson, one of the early lectures that she gave on this particular book. And yeah, that's all I can really say. It's going to be very challenging to do this book because I think I have reservations. And folks might say this is anti-blackness. They may say that it doesn't make logical sense, but I have reservations anytime white people are excited. I think I've said this before. Anytime white people are happy, I'm suspicious. And it seems that a lot of white people really like this book. It's on the New York Times top 10 book list. President Obama put this on his 2011 summer reading list, and I just cannot imagine Neely Fuller Jr. ever ending up on that summer reading list, or the ISIS Papers, or Amos Wilson, or any number of authors who have produced phenomenal work that would help us get a better understanding of racism, white supremacy. I just can't imagine them ending up on President Obama's summer reading list. I don't even know what's on the summer reading list for this summer. But at any rate, I have a hard time believing that white people would put such monumental endorsements behind a book that has constructive information on racism, white supremacy. I could be wrong. I'm trying to think of exceptions to the rule. I will say that I think, generally speaking, they give white people, other racists, more leeway to speak truthfully about racism, white supremacy, and then, allow them to make money doing it and give them all sorts of awards and accolades. Timothy Wise, Douglas Blackman, he's been on both of them, I guess, have been on the program before. At any rate, as I said, it will be challenging for me. I will say, if a white person had written this book, I would be much more critical. I would be even way more critical than I'm being right now. If a white person had written this book, I would be chomping at the bit to get down and dissect everything, and even that, to be starting a lecture on this sort of book, talking about the importance of not having barriers between white and black friendship. That would be enough right there to get me ready to roll, to carve this book up. But it will be a challenge. I'm going to monitor so that I'm not talking bad about a victim of racism, so that hopefully we get as much constructive information out of the text as possible. And keep that in mind. Why are white people so infatuated with this book? That might be something that's good to keep in mind as we roll. We will get started. This book is going to be the longest that we have done for our study session thus far, easily. I think this is going to take us through the rest of the summer. This book is almost 700 pages. So sit back, get comfortable. Keep in mind, white people love this book. Why would a racist promote such a work? Isabel Wilkerson, The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration. Context of White Supremacy, first audio segment.
To my mother and to the memory of my father, whose migration made me possible, and to the millions of others like them who dared to act upon their dreams. I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant in alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom. Richard Wright. Part 1. In the Land of the Forefathers. Our mattresses were made of corn shucks and soft gray Spanish moss that hung from the trees. From the swamps we got soup turtles and baby alligators, and from the woods we got raccoon, rabbit, and possum. Mahalia Jackson, Moving On Up. Leaving. This land is first and foremost his handiwork. It was he who brought order out of primeval wilderness. Wherever one looks in this land, whatever one sees that is the work of man, was erected by the toiling, straining bodies of blacks. David L. Cohn, God Shakes Creation. They fly from the land that bore them. W. H. Stillwell. 1. Chickasaw County, Mississippi, late October, 1937. Ida Mae Brandon Gladney. The night clouds were closing in on the salt licks east of the Oxbow Lakes along the folds in the earth beyond the Yallabusha River. The cotton was at last cleared from the field. Ida Mae tried now to get the children ready and to gather the clothes and quilts and somehow keep her mind off the churning within her. She had sold off the turkeys and doled out in secret the old stools, the wash pots, the tin tub, the bed pallets. Her husband was settling with Mr. Ed, over the worth of a year's labor, and she did not know what would come of it. None of them had been on a train before, not unless you counted the clattering local from Bacon Switch to Okolona, where by the time you sit down, you there, as Ida May put it. None of them had been out of Mississippi, or Chickasaw County for that matter. There was no explaining to little James and Velma the stuffed bags and chaos and all that was at stake, or why they had to put on their shoes and not cry, and bring undue attention from anyone who might happen to see them leaving. Things had to look normal, like any other time they might ride into town, which was rare enough to begin with. Velma was 6. She sat with her ankles crossed and 3 braids in her hair and did what she was told. James was too little to understand. He was 3. He was upset at the commotion. "Hold still now, James. Let me put your shoes on," Ida May told him. James wriggled and kicked. He did not like shoes. He ran free in the field. What were these things? He did not like them on his feet. So Ida May let him go barefoot. Miss Theeney stood watching. One by one, her children had left her and gone up north. Sam and Cleve to Ohio, Josie to Syracuse, Irene to Milwaukee. Now the man Miss Theeney had tried to keep Ida May from marrying in the first place was taking her away, too. Miss Theeney had no choice but to accept it, and let Ida May and the grandchildren go for good. Miss Theeney drew them close to her, as she always did, whenever anyone was leaving. She had them bow their heads. She whispered a prayer that her daughter and her daughter's family be protected on the long journey ahead in the Jim Crow car. "May the Lord be the first one in the car," she prayed, "and the last out." When the time had come, Ida May and little James and Velma and all that they could carry were loaded into a brother-in-law's truck, and the 3 of them went to meet Ida May's husband at the train depot in Okolona for the night ride out of the bottomland. 2. Wildwood, Florida, April 14th, 1945. George Swanson Starling. A man named Roscoe Colton gave Lil George Starling a ride in his pickup truck to the train station in Wildwood through the fruit-bearing scrubland of central Florida. And Schoolboy, as the toothless orange pickers mockingly called him, boarded the Silver Meteor, pointing north. A railing divided the stairs onto the train, one side of the railing for white passengers, the other for colored, so the soles of their shoes would not touch the same stair. He boarded on the colored side of the railing, a final reminder from the place of his birth of the absurdity of the world he was leaving. He was getting out alive, so he didn't let it bother him. "I got on the car where they told me to get on," he said years later. He hadn't had time to bid farewell to everyone he wanted to. He stopped to say goodbye to Rachel Jackson, who owned a little cafe up on what they called the Avenue, and the few others he could safely get to in the little time he had. He figured everybody in Egypttown, the colored section of Eustis, probably knew he was leaving before he had climbed onto the train, small as the town was, and as much as people talked. It was a clear afternoon in the middle of April. He folded his tall frame into the hard surface of the seat, his knees knocking against the seat back in front of him. He was packed into the Jim Crow car, where the railroad stored the luggage, when the train pulled away at last. He was on the run, and he wouldn't rest easy until he was out of range of Lake County, beyond the reach of the Grove owners whose invisible laws he had broken. The train rumbled past the forest of citrus trees that he had climbed since he was a boy, and that he had tried to wrestle some dignity out of, and for a time had. They could have their trees. He wasn't going to lose his life over them. He had come close enough as it was. He had lived up to his family's accidental surname, Starling, distant cousin to the mockingbird. He had spoken up about what he had seen in the world he was born into, like the starling that sang Mozart's own music back to him, or the starling out of Shakespeare that tormented the king, by speaking the name of Mortimer. Only George was paying the price for tormenting the ruling class that owned the citrus groves. There was no place in the Jim Crow South for a colored starling like him. He didn't know what he would do once he got to New York, or what his life would be. He didn't know how long it would take before he could send for Inez. His wife was mad right now, but she'd get over it once he got her there. At least that's what he told himself. He turned his face to the north and sat with his back to Florida. Leaving as he did, he figured he would never set foot in Eustis again for as long as he lived. And as he settled in for the 23-hour train ride up the coast of the Atlantic, he had no desire to have anything to do with the town he grew up in, the state of Florida, or the South as a whole, for that matter. 3. Monroe, Louisiana, Easter Monday, April 6th, 1953. Robert Joseph Pershing Foster. In the dark hours of the morning, Pershing Foster packed his surgery books, his medical bag, and his suit and sport coats in the trunk, along with a map, an address book, and Ivory Covington's fried chicken left over from Saturday night. He said goodbye to his father, who had told him to follow his dreams. His father's dreams had fallen apart, but there was still hope for the son, the father knew. He had a reluctant embrace with his older brother Madison, who had tried in vain to get him to stay. Then Pershing pointed his 1949 Buick Roadmaster, a burgundy one with white-wall tires and a shark-tooth grill, in the direction of 5 Points, the crossroads of town. He drove down the narrow dirt roads with the ditches on either side that when he was a boy had left his freshly pressed Sunday suit caked with mud when it rained. He passed the shotgun houses perched on cinder blocks and hurtled over the railroad tracks away from where people who looked like him were consigned to live, and into the section where the roads were not dirt ditches anymore, but suddenly level and paved. He headed in the direction of Dessert Street, the main thoroughfare, and without a whiff of sentimentality, sped away from the small-town bank buildings and bail bondsmen, the Paramount Theater with its urine-scented steps, and away from St. Francis Hospital, which wouldn't let doctors who looked like him perform a simple tonsillectomy. Perhaps he might have stayed had they let him practice surgery like he was trained to do, or let him walk into the palace and try on a suit like anyone else of his station. The resentments had grown heavy over the years. He knew he was as smart as anybody else, smarter to his mind, but he wasn't allowed to do anything with it, the caste system being what it was. Now he was going about as far away as you could get from Monroe, Louisiana. The rope lines that had hemmed in his life seemed to loosen with each plodding mile on the odometer. Like many of the men in the Great Migration, and like many emigrant men in general, he was setting out alone. He would scout out the new world on his own and get situated before sending for anyone else. He drove west into the morning stillness and onto the Endham Bridge, a tight crossing with one lane acting like two that spans the Ouachita River into West Monroe. He would soon pass the mossback flatland of central Louisiana and the Red River toward Texas, where he was planning to see an old friend from medical school, a Dr. Anthony Beale, en route to California. Pershing had no idea where he would end up in California, or how he would make a go of it, or when he would be able to wrest his wife and daughters from the in-laws who had tried to talk him out of going to California in the first place. He would contemplate these uncertainties in the unbroken days ahead. From Louisiana, he followed the hyphens in the road that blurred together toward a faraway place, bridging unrelated things as hyphens do. Alone in the car, he had close to 2,000 miles of curving road in front of him, farther than farm worker emigrants leaving Guatemala for Texas, not to mention Tijuana for California, where a wind from the south could blow a Mexican clothesline over the border. In our homes, in our churches, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, there is a discussion of what is best to do. Must we remain in the South or go elsewhere? Where can we go to feel that security which other people feel? Is it best to go in great numbers or only in several families? These and many other things are discussed over and over. A Colored Woman in Alabama, 1902. The Great Migration, 1915 to 1970. They fled as if under a spell or a high fever. They left as though they were fleeing some curse, wrote the scholar Emmett J. Scott. They were willing to make almost any sacrifice to obtain a railroad ticket, and they left with the intention of staying. From the early years of the 20th century to well past its middle age, nearly every black family in the American South, which meant nearly every black family in America, had a decision to make. There were sharecroppers losing at settlement, typists wanting to work in an office, yard boys scared that a single gesture near the planter's wife could leave them hanging from an oak tree. They were all stuck in a caste system as hard and unyielding as the red Georgia clay, and they each had a decision before them. In this, they were not unlike anyone who ever longed to cross the Atlantic or the Rio Grande. It was during the First World War that a silent pilgrimage took its first steps within the borders of this country. The fever rose without warning or notice, or much in the way of understanding by those outside its reach. It would not end until the 1970s, and would set into motion changes in the North and South that no one, not even the people doing the leaving, could have imagined at the start of it, or dreamed would take nearly a lifetime to play out. Historians would come to call it the Great Migration. It would become, perhaps, the biggest underreported story of the 20th century. It was vast. It was leaderless. It crept along so many thousands of currents over so long a stretch of time as to be difficult for the press truly to capture while it was underway. Over the course of 6 decades, some 6 million black Southerners left the land of their forefathers and fanned out across the country for an uncertain existence in nearly every other corner of America. The Great Migration would become a turning point in history. It would transform urban America and recast the social and political order of every city it touched. It would force the South to search its soul and finally to lay aside a feudal caste system. It grew out of the unmet promises made after the Civil War, and through the sheer weight of it, helped push the country toward the civil rights revolutions of the 1960s. During this time, a good portion of all black Americans alive picked up and left the tobacco farms of Virginia, the rice plantations of South Carolina, cotton fields in East Texas and Mississippi, and the villages and backwoods of the remaining southern states, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, North Carolina, Tennessee, and by some measures, Oklahoma. They set out for cities they had whispered of among themselves, or had seen in a mail-order catalog. Some came straight from the field, with their King James Bibles and old 12-string guitars. Still more were townspeople looking to be their fuller selves, tradesmen following their customers, pastors trailing their flocks. They would cross into alien lands with fast, new ways of speaking and carrying oneself, and with hard-to-figure rules and laws. The New World held out higher wages but staggering rents that the people had to calculate like a foreign currency. The places they went were big, frightening, and already crowded. New York, Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and smaller, equally foreign cities, Syracuse, Oakland, Milwaukee, Newark, Gary. Each turned into a receiving station and port of refuge, wrote the poet Carl Sandburg, then a Chicago newspaper reporter documenting the unfolding migration there. The people did not cross the turnstiles of customs at Ellis Island. They were already citizens. But where they came from, they were not treated as such. Their every step was controlled by the meticulous laws of Jim Crow, a 19th-century minstrel figure that would become shorthand for the violently enforced codes of the Southern caste system. The Jim Crow regime persisted from the 1880s to the 1960s, some 80 years, the average lifespan of a fairly healthy man. It afflicted the lives of at least 4 generations, and would not die without bloodshed, as the people who left the South foresaw. Over time, this mass relocation would come to dwarf the California gold rush of the 1850s with its 100,000 participants, and the Dust Bowl migration of some 300,000 people from Oklahoma and Arkansas to California in the 1930s. But more remarkably, it was the first mass act of independence by a people who were in bondage in this country for far longer than they have been free. The story of the Great Migration is among the most dramatic and compelling in all chapters of American history, the Mississippi historian Neil McMillan wrote toward the end of the 20th century. So far-reaching are its effects, even now, that we scarcely understand its meaning. Its imprint is everywhere in urban life. The configuration of the cities as we know them, the social geography of black and white neighborhoods, the spread of the housing projects, as well as the rise of a well-scrubbed black middle class, along with the alternating waves of white flight and suburbanization. All of these grew directly or indirectly from the response of everyone touched by the Great Migration. So, too, rose the language and music of urban America that sprang from the blues that came with the migrants and dominates our airwaves to this day. So, too, came the people who might not have existed, or become who they did, had there been no Great Migration. People as diverse as James Baldwin and Michelle Obama, Miles Davis and Toni Morrison, Spike Lee and Denzel Washington, and anonymous teachers, store clerks, steelworkers, and physicians were all products of the Great Migration. They were all children whose life chances were altered because a parent or grandparent had made the hard decision to leave. The Great Migration would not end until the 1970s, when the South began finally to change. The whites-only signs came down, the all-white schools opened up, and everyone could vote. By then, nearly half of all black Americans, some 47%, would be living outside the South, compared to 10% when the migration began. Oftentimes, just to go away, wrote John Dollard, a Yale scholar studying the South in the 1930s, is one of the most aggressive things that another person can do, and if the means of expressing discontent are limited, as in this case, it is one of the few ways in which pressure can be put. By the time it was over, no northern or western city would be the same. In Chicago alone, the black population rocketed from 44,103, just under 3% of the population, at the start of the migration, to more than 1 million at the end of it. By the turn of the 21st century, blacks made up a third of the city's residents, with more blacks living in Chicago than in the entire state of Mississippi. It was a folk movement of incalculable moment, McMillan said, and more than that, it was the first big step the nation's servant class ever took, without asking. The passenger train came wheezing through the North Georgia mountains after the colored school let out, and when it passed through the hill town of Rome, Georgia, back during the Depression, a little girl would run down the embankment and wait for it to rush past the locust trees. She would wave to the people in the metal boxes on wheels, the important people, their faces looking away, and dream of going wherever it was they were rushing to. Years later, she got on a train herself, heading north. The rail car was filled with the expectant faces of people hoping for all the rights and privileges of citizenship. She stepped off at Union Station in the border city of Washington, D.C. It was the start of the North, filled as it was with grand squares and circles named after Northern heroes of the Civil War: Ulysses S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, George Henry Thomas, David G. Farragut. Names to this day reviled in the South. She made her way to the address she had been given and settled onto the fold-out sofa in the front room of a second cousin she barely knew. Soon afterward, she performed a ritual of arrival that just about every migrant did, almost without thinking. She got her picture taken in the New World. It would prove that she had arrived. It was the migrant's version of a passport. The picture is sepia, 2 by 3 inches, from the 40s. 2 young women sit on the front steps of a row house on R Street in Washington, looking very Betty Davis. Stacked heels and padded shoulders, wool coats brushing their knees. They are new in town. Childhood friends from Georgia, meeting up now in the big city. Their faces give no hint of whatever indignities the South had visited upon them. That was over now. Their faces are all smiles and optimism. The one in the pearls used to greet the train when she was little and dream of going with it. She would become a teacher, and years later, my mother. As a girl, I found the picture in a drawer in the living room, where many of those artifacts of migration likely ended up. I stared into the faces, searched the light in their eyes, the width of their smiles, for clues as to how they got there. Where did they go? What were they looking for? How did they get the courage to leave all they ever knew for a place they had never seen? The will to be more than the South said they had a right to be. Was it a braver thing to stay, or was it a braver thing to go? What would have happened if she had not gone north and met and married the Tuskegee airman from Virginia, a migrant himself, who would become my father? Would I and millions of other people born in the North and West have even existed? What would have happened had all those people raised under Jim Crow not spilled out of the South looking for something better? If they had not gone north, what would New York look like? What would Philadelphia, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Los Angeles, Washington, and Oakland look like? What, for that matter, would the South look like? Would it have changed on its own? Or did the Black Exodus force the South to face itself in ways no one could ever have thought possible? What would have happened if I'd stayed? My mother asked out loud, repeating a question put to her one day. I don't even want to think about that. She never used the term Great Migration, or any grand label for what she did, nor did she see her decision as having any meaning beyond herself. Yet she and millions of others like her were right in the middle of it. At one point, 10,000 were arriving every month in Chicago alone. It made for a spectacle at the railroad platforms, both north and south. I went to the station to see a friend who was leaving. Emmett J. Scott, an official at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, wrote shortly after the migration began. I could not get in the station. There were so many people turning like bees in a hive. Those millions of people and what they did would seep into nearly every realm of American culture, into the words of Ralph Ellison and Toni Morrison, the plays of Lorraine Hansberry and August Wilson, the poetry and music of Langston Hughes and B.B. King, and the latter-day generation of Arrested Development and Tupac Shakur. It all but consumed the work of Richard Wright, the bard of the Great Migration. He gave voice to the fears and yearnings of his fellow migrants through his novel Native Son and his autobiography Black Boy. He had been a sharecropper's son in Natchez, Mississippi. He defected to the receiving station of Chicago via Memphis in December 1927 to feel, as he put it, the warmth of other suns. Yet for all of its influence, the migration was so vast that throughout history it has most often been consigned to the landscape, rarely the foreground. Scholars have devoted their attention to the earliest phase of the migration, the World War I era. Less has been written about the more massive sequence of migration that began during World War II, the historian James N. Gregory wrote in 2005, and a comprehensive treatment of the century-long story of black migration does not exist. This book addresses that omission. The stories in this book are based on the accounts of people who gave hundreds of hours of their days to share with me what was perhaps the singular turning point in their lives. They were among more than 1,200 people I interviewed for this book in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Milwaukee, and Oakland. All of them journeyed from the South during the Great Migration, and it is their collective stories that inform every aspect of this book. For the three main characters, Ida Mae Brandon Gladney, George Swanson Starling, and Robert Joseph Pershing Foster, and for others like them, the circumstances of their migrations shaped who they were and defined the course of their fortunes or misfortunes and the lives of their descendants. The events were thus easily recounted when the participants were called upon to do so. Official records corroborated those details that were indeed verifiable. But it is the larger emotional truths, the patient retelling of people's interior lives and motivations, that are the singular gift of the accounts in this book. With the passing of the earliest and succeeding generations of migrants, it is these stories that have become the least replaceable sources of any understanding of this great movement of people out of the South to the American North and West. This book covers a span of some 100 years. As the narrative moves through time, the language changes to retain the authenticity of each era. The word colored is used during the portion of the book in which that term was a primary identifier for black people, that is, during the first 2/3 of the 20th century, as evidenced by the colored high schools the people attended and the signage that directed them to segregated facilities. As the narrative moves into the 1960s, it shifts to the use of the term black, after it gained popularity during the Civil Rights era, and then to both black and African American in the current era. Over time, the story of the Great Migration has suffered distortions that have miscast an entire population. From the moment the emigrants set foot in the North and West, they were blamed for the troubles of the cities they fled to. They were said to have brought family dysfunction with them, to more likely be out of work, unwed parents, and on welfare than the people already there. In the past 20 years, however, an altogether different picture has emerged from ongoing research by scholars of the Great Migration. Closer analysis of newly available census records has found that, contrary to conventional thought, black migrants were actually more likely to be married and to raise their children in two-parent households, and less likely to bear children out of wedlock. Compared with northern-born blacks, writes the sociologist Stuart E. Tolnay, a leading expert on the migration, Southern migrants had higher rates of participation in the labor force, lower levels of unemployment, higher incomes, lower levels of poverty and welfare dependency. The lives of the people in this book bear out this more complex understanding of the Great Migration, and based on the new data, represent the more common migrant experience than many previous accounts. Despite the overlapping of time and place in the text, the three main people in this narrative never met or knew one another. Their paths never crossed, except through their experiences with me, and metaphorically through the interlocking chapters of this book. The narrative portrays the phenomenon through people unknown to one another, in the way that migrants moving along different currents would not have intersected, their anonymity a metaphor for the vast and isolating nature of the migration itself. The actions of the people in this book were both universal and distinctly American. Their migration was a response to an economic and social structure not of their making. They did what humans have done for centuries when life became untenable, what the Pilgrims did under the tyranny of British rule, what the Scotch-Irish did in Oklahoma when the land turned to dust, what the Irish did when there was nothing to eat, what the European Jews did during the spread of Nazism, what the landless in Russia, Italy, China, and elsewhere did when something better across the ocean called to them. What binds these stories together was the back against the wall, reluctant yet hopeful search for something better, any place but where they were. They did what human beings looking for freedom throughout history have often done. They left. Part 2. Beginnings. This was the culture from which I sprang. This was the terror from which I fled. Richard Wright, Black Boy. Ida Mae Brandon Gladney. Chicago, 1996. From the open door in the vestibule, I see her. She is sitting in a cotton house dress on a baby blue plastic-covered easy chair by the window. She is looking through a parting of the curtains at the street circus below. There they are, all scuffling beneath her. Urban drug dealers, falling down sweatpants pooling at their feet, now bent over the driver's side window of a late-model sedan from the suburbs. Fourth graders doing lookout for men who could be their fathers. Young girls with their stomachs swelling already. Middle-aged men living out of their Pontiacs. Gangsters who might not make it to the weekend. She lives on the second floor of a 3-flat on the south side of Chicago. She taps her foot and moves closer to the sill. This is not what she had come to Chicago for, nor was it what she expected it to be. But here she is, and this is what it has become. A place so dangerously absurd that it is living entertainment in her old age. She knows the street names and the code words for all the hustlers and pushers playing out their lives beneath her window. And even though they may have just shot a rival or just got out on parole, they look out for her and greet her kindly. You watch yourself now, Grandma, because there is something sweet and kind about her. And she is from the old country and has survived a life of fear and privation they will never know. She has an endearing gap in her teeth, which go just about any which way they please, and her hair is now as soft and white as the cotton she used to pick, not particularly well back in Mississippi. She is the color of sand on a beach, which she had heard of growing up, but had never seen for herself until she arrived in Chicago, half a lifetime ago. She has big, searching eyes that see the good in people despite the evil she has seen, and she has a comforting kind of eternal beauty, her skin like the folds of a velvet shawl. Her name is Ida May, and she is a long way from where she started, back in the hard soil of the eastern foothills of Mississippi during the century's adolescence. She leans forward and adjusts herself for a long conversation. Her hazel eyes grow big as she begins to tell her story. Van Vliet, Mississippi, 1928. Ida May Brandon Gladney. It began, like many stories do, with a man. Actually, 2 men. They both came calling in the quiet hours of the hot season, when the cotton lay gestating in the field. Ida May had just sprouted into a woman of 15, and the suitors were out front, clutching their hats to their chests. They descended from opposite corners of old Chickasaw County, down the dirt roads that became mud rivers in the wet season and dust clouds in the dry, but were the only route to the bottomland by the Natchez Trace, and an audience with Ida May, who was amused by it all. David McIntosh came after church on a tall red horse, the sun slanting heat through the hackberry trees, and he was always the first one there. He sat stiff in his Sunday clothes and sugar-talked the daughter in an old chair in the front room, while her mother, Miss Theeney, stood peeping by the door. When he had said all he had to say, which was never soon enough for Miss Theeney, he climbed back on his horse, and as the daughter suspected, rode off to another girl he was weighing, named Sally. George Gladney walked 3 or 4 miles past the salt licks of Long Creek and over the railroad tracks to see Ida May. It took him longer than it took David McIntosh, and by the time he got there, his shirt was wet with perspiration and brown from the dust clouds stirred up on the road. Sometimes David's horse was still tied out front. George was a quiet, austere man and felt a certain proprietorship toward Ida May. He waited for David to finish before going in himself. He stood outside and watched David mount his horse and gallop away before walking up the plank steps of the porch. Coming in second would give him more time to win the girl over and assess her fitness as a wife. Miss Theeney was not particular about either one of them. To begin with, they were too old for Ida May, trotting up the porch in their 20s when Ida May hadn't long turned 15. David was barely as tall as Ida May, and both of them were too dark by Miss Theeney's reckoning. She had little assurance of her daughter's upward mobility in a world where most colored women were sharecroppers' wives, but she could hope for the more favorable economic prospects of a lighter man, based on his acceptability to white people, and even kinship to them, maybe, which would be all the better. Ida May didn't go for that kind of talk and didn't pay it much attention. One color of wildflower was no better than another to her, so she made no distinctions whatsoever. She had a way of looking past the outer layer of people and seemed to regard everyone she met with a kind of searching intensity, as if this were the first person she had ever seen. In any case, Miss Theeney's protests were likely just an excuse. Whatever his attributes, Miss Theeney was not inclined to like any man that came courting her second girl. Miss Theeney gave birth to her in a little wood house on Cousin Irie's land and named her May Ida, after her husband's mother, Ida. It was March 5th, 1913, some 3 years after the start of the Great Migration that Ida May would unwittingly become a part of. There was a spark inside of her, and when she got big enough, she told people to call her Ida May instead of May Ida. She would later say it sounded less old-timey to her, but it was an early indication that she could think for herself when she chose to. She was a small-framed girl with a chiseled face the color of nut butter, and her dark brown hair in plaits most of the time. It turned out she was fearless and spirited, and liked doing the kinds of things men are known for doing. She was no good in the field, but she could chop wood and kill snakes, and didn't mind doing it, and that was a good thing for Miss Theeney. By the time men started showing up on the porch for Ida May, Miss Theeney was a widow, left to tend the land they lived on all by herself. She stood eye to eye with most men, and suffered no fools, but she had little help now. Her oldest daughter, Irene, had gone off and gotten married. Her 2 grown sons, Sam and Cleve, had fled north to Ohio, like more and more colored boys chafing in the South seemed to be doing. Her husband, Joseph, had just about run them off before he died. Joseph would beat them for any little thing, since they weren't his blood like the girls were, and that didn't make them want to stay either. So they went up north. That left Miss Theeney with her youngest daughters, Josephine, who was able to work but wouldn't, and Talma, who was too young to work, and her second, the tomboy, Ida May. On her way home from school, Ida May climbed up the hickory and walnut trees on the side of the road and shook them down. She picked the skittle bumps off the ground and cracked them on her teeth. She saw how her brothers relieved themselves in the woods at the side of a tree and tried it herself. Being a girl, it didn't work as well when she tried it standing up. Sam and Cleve, before they'd left, had to shoo her away when they went out hunting rabbit. She crouched behind the trees, and they heard her rustling near them, and threw tapsticks at her, the sticks they took to kill the rabbits with. Sometimes she spotted a rabbit sleeping and popped it with a tapstick, and along with whatever her brothers took in, they would eat well that night. Sometimes her brothers didn't want to be bothered, so they gave her a quarter and let her plow in their place so they could go to a pickup baseball game. She'd get behind the mule and go up and down the field, cutting lines in the earth as if it were the most important job in the world. The kids started calling her Tom because she acted more like a boy. They lived on the curving land in the hill country of northeast Mississippi. It was a voluptuous place, more beautiful than the delta land along the great river, and like anything beautiful, had a tendency to break grown people's hearts. It was not meant to work as hard as it was made to when it came to sewing cotton, and of the 2 regions, it had the more difficult birthing pains. Joseph Brandon had come into ownership of a piece of bottom land where he planted cotton and grew hogs. The land that colored men managed to get was usually scratch land nobody wanted. Still, he courted the land every spring. He cut lines in the earth with an old till, a swayback mule, and a horse named Jim. He planted cottonseed in the topsoil and tried to conjure rain. When the land turned green, he chopped the unwanted leaves that got in the way of the buds trying to grow. By late summer, if the rains had come but not rotted the seed, if the sun had burned long enough by day and the dew had descended by night, dry snow sprang from the earth at the tips of low scrub that came to bud with his prayers and sweat. The land would be salted with white confetti that spread out to the tree line. Then he had to bend down in the beating sun to pick the bolls and crouch and crawl to reach the lowest buds. Before she was big enough to see over the cotton, Ida May followed her father out to the field. He gave her a flour sack to keep her occupied, and she tagged behind him and gathered cotton bolls, even though what little she brought in was not of much use. It turned out she had no talent whatsoever for the field and didn't like the chore of picking. But her father was always out there, and picking gave her time with him.
Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. The number again, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. And again, for folks, if you are not interested in using a phone to dial in, you may also use the address tiny.cc/1race, and that is the number 1, tiny, TINY.cc/1race. Just use the blue button on the left of the screen. It says Flash Phone. Click it. It will open a small window on the first line. The number that I just gave, you'll see a little drop-down window. Select that number, 760-569-7676. On the second line, where it says code, the code, 564943. On the third line, you can put in a nickname, handle, use your real name. You can even leave it blank. Just press the green button at the bottom to place the call. It will connect you. You should be able to hear the program. If you would like to participate, you'll see the little dial pad. Press *6. It'll give you an audio prompt to press 1, and it'll put your hand up, and you can participate in the dialogue. We will hit the phone lines. I will hit hands as I see them go up. I think this is B. Moore, should be with us. Any thoughts on Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns?
Peace, Gus. Can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, peace, Gus, and all the other listeners. Yes, I do have some thoughts. I have a few. The first is when she was talking about the non-white male who was a doctor, and saying how he was, trained to be a doctor, but he couldn't practice or perform simple procedures. Like the procedure they talked about was tonsillectomy or something like that. And I was just thinking, what's new? Even in 2013, it's the same difference. I thought of two stories that came to mind. The story of the doctor or the nurse that was denied the patient, I believe because the parents didn't want a black person to practice on their child. That came to mind. And then the doctor, I believe he was in North Carolina, he did the race car project. 55 miles per hour means you black boy. So those two stories came to mind, although I know there are many others. I was just thinking that white people don't care how much education you have or how well you articulate. You're still beneath them, and they still feel like you're a nigger. Yeah. The next thing is that she was talking about non-white males that were scared that simple gesture towards farmers' wives could leave them hanging from a tree. Emmett Till came to mind, and also the modern-day Emmett Tills. Several non-white males that have been found hanging, and they say, oh, it's a suicide, but these same non-white males have, I'll say alleged to be in tragic arrangements with white women. That came to mind. And then the talk of they're coming from the field. She talks of all these different plantations in different states, sugar plantation, cotton plantation, and how they came from the field with their King James Bible. It made me think of certain states in the South. I live in one now, and I believe I'm from one as well, but I live in North Carolina. They call them the Bible Belt, and so I thought about that. And a lot of these states still have plantations, and they kind of have these plantations like museums. Like in Charlotte, they have like a ladder plantation, and they have it at the museum where you can still visit to this day and see how it was on the plantation and a whole bunch of crap. But yeah, I was just thinking of how Christianity and the influence of religion that it has on white supremacy. And then I also took note of when she started talking of the non-white name changes, colored, Negro, black, African American, and I was just thinking that's just confusion. And then the last thing was she fast-forwarded to modern day, I believe she was talking about the 90s, and she was describing the neighborhood that the woman lived in. I hung my head, but that's all for now.
Good observations. Good observations. I think it's reminding me of Warriors Don't Cry, Melvin Patilla Beals, thinking that white Jesus is going to be a recurring figure in this book. I don't know how you could tell a story of black people early 20th century without a heavy dose of white Jesus. So stay tuned. I'm sure he will be a recurring figure. 2658, your line should be open as well.
Greetings, sir. Greetings, everyone.
Evening. Good to hear from you.
By listening, the thought comes to my mind. I'm second generation. My mother has stories similar to what the writer is speaking about. My mother came up in a place called Cordell, Georgia. And I would say probably the most famous, well-known person that I can think of that came from the same area was the Honorable Elijah Muhammad before he moved to Detroit. My family dispersed in several different directions. My mother followed her oldest sister to the place on earth that's called Miami, Florida. Right now, that sister is about 94 years old, and she still has her passport that gave non-white black people permission to work in the Coral Gables area in South Florida. You had to have a passport in order to do that. If you didn't, you would be in some trouble if you didn't have your papers. Go on to listening. I heard the last caller mention about the different racial designations. I remember my grandmother, she always used the term colored. When I was a child, Negro was the accepted term. When black came around, it was actually looked down upon by the older non-white black people, and that was in something like the late 60s. there was this debate between black and Negro, of all things to be fighting about. But that's basically. I've had family that moved to Chicago, like was said in the prior reading. More northeast to areas like New Jersey, and also the way I itemize is similar to what I heard the reader said somewhere in the readings. Basically, with non-white black people escaping, with the idea in mind that they would be going to something better. Probably employment was better than it's been in some other times. Of course, it was labor type of stuff with your hands, cleaning up something, that sort of thing. My father was a barber, so he worked with his hands also. But yeah, I'm hearing some similar stories. And it's probably going to be a lot more. Last but not least, I was just thinking, probably why the president has the book is because he probably will want to have an understanding of what non-white black people existence in the 20th century was about. I don't think that hits him personally in his life based on what I know about who his two parents were. His wife's parents have a story, I'm pretty sure. But I don't think he did, personally. And he probably wants to, quote-unquote, bone up on it. But that's it for me for right now.
I know that. Interesting thought. If anybody, folks can ponder on that. I guess that doesn't have to be today, since you'll have lots of time, months, to ponder on it as we work through this. Why President Obama, this is on his 2011 summer reading list. I guess I should have probably checked what's on the reading list for this summer, see if he had anything interesting. I'll do that, try and do that today before the program concludes. I'll make sure that I say, as I've said repeatedly, all of us have been contaminated by the system of white supremacy and the anti-blackness that the system demands that everybody has. I am not immune. Could be my anti-blackness, and white people got on my nerves today. White women got on my nerves today, like all day long. And it was only two of them. I wasn't even around anybody today, but they really got on my nerves today. So I could just be having a white supremacy stress reaction because of the trifling racist heifers that I've had to deal with today. It was only two of them again. But there was one passage, right before I even get to what I wanted to point out. If at any point during the time that we're on this book, if you feel like, Gus, you're being critical of a victim or of her book, this is great material, and you're just beating up on a victim, feel free to make sure you get that in. Gus has not written two sentences. She's written an award-winning book, almost 700 pages with thorough research. She said she took 15 years to put this together. So I definitely don't want to disparage or minimize her scholarship. You have license to chime in whenever you feel like it, if you feel like I am bashing another victim. That said, the passage where she says, and she says this frequently, like I'd heard this, she says this in some of her talks on the book, where she says that the Great Migration, that this, I'll read exactly what she says, more and more than that, this Great Migration was the first big step the nation's servant class ever took without asking. If a white person had said that, I would have said, oh my, that is an astronomically racist thing to say. If you're going to tell me that's the first thing that black people did here as a symbolic act against racism, white supremacy, or this is the first thing that they did without having to get permission from a white person, I'm extraordinarily offended. This would be another one. You might as well just call me a nigger and skip everything else, because that's totally skipping over all of the black people who resisted during slavery. Harriet Tubman, Harriet Jacobs, Frederick Douglass, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey and all of the other nameless victims of racism who did things prior to the 1900s. Wow. If a white person had said that, I would have had a lot more to say. I would have really went to town about that. And just paying attention to words. She keeps saying caste system. That's another one. She uses that term frequently when she gives lectures as well, and it's in this book. Just so that I'm not talking a lot, we have other hands. You can count the number of times you've heard caste system today. You have not heard the word racism, and you will hear the word racism in a book that's almost 700 pages about black people's struggles with quote-unquote Jim Crow. The word racism is in this book one time. The person who called in from 8562, your line is open. Anyone out who, does not think that is a point of interest, or you don't understand why I think that is extremely significant, feel free. I'm more than comfortable just leaving that hanging and let people think on that, how the term caste system can continually be used. And I guess I'll even give you an example so that you can marinate on it. Let me think of a good one. I was highlighting where caste system pops up in here. The one that I highlighted, the biggest. Let's see. Okay. I do have the book, but I have the ebook version, so this is going to be another one where my pages will not correspond with anyone if you have the hard copy version of the book. So this is in the first portion. I guess it would be kind of early on, where she says, okay. Perhaps he might have stayed had they let him practice surgery, to be Moore's point about the doctor, like he was trained to do, or let him walk into the palace and try on a suit like anyone else of his station. The resentments had grown heavy over the years. He knew he was smart, as anybody else, smarter to his mind, but he wasn't allowed to do anything with it. The caste system being what it was. Talking as though, and I think she says later on that the South let go of their caste system. I guess I would point to anyone and say they seem to be having a lot of trouble in Florida over the past few months. Jordan Davis and what have you. I can omit the more popular names, but they still seem to be having a lot of problems, even though this caste system is supposed to be non-existent. The folks that dialed in 8562. 8562, your line is open, and I think this is Mr. Weish, Terrell Weish. Your line should be open as well.
Yeah. Good evening. Can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. You said she mentioned racism. I didn't hear it. When did she mention it?
Oh, no, I'm sorry if I was not clear. She does not use the term racism. It's used in this book one time, and you haven't heard it yet, and you're not going to hear it probably until September. It's at the very end of the book, so it'll probably be 2 months before the word racism pops up in this book.
And what is the race of the speaker?
The author is a black female. The narrator, I believe, is a black female. Her name is Miles. Let me make sure I'm getting it right. I think she is Robin Miles. That's her name, Robin Miles. You can look at her picture. I can put it up on my Facebook page. I think she is a black female, non-white female, but she's kind of pale. So you all can check it out yourself. But I think she's a non-white female, black female.
Okay. I don't know if I'm a bit harsh on her, but what I have here is like she mentioned something about Southern blacks and Northern blacks, and saying something like Southern blacks were better than Northern blacks. Like, I think she was saying, like, better marriages, had better jobs, better income. And I find that, like, very, like, particular, like, white supremacy racism. It does that. Like, it says that when the people from Caribbean came here, they did the same thing. They took the jobs from the Americans, and now they say the Hispanics take the jobs. So I find, like, that, a pattern with racism with that. And she said something about a girl cocking up to pee-pee, and I'm thinking like gender confusion with that. I don't know what else. Yeah, that's what I have so far.
That is interesting. That was the Ida Mae. That was the one she was. I guess they called her Tom.
Yeah, she was a tomboy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I found out, I was like, why is she, you know what I mean? If she was going to pee in the woods, I would think she was still stooped down. But it's not like she was cocking up her leg or something, or sticking up her leg. Yeah.
Seemed like it took her, I think she was saying the other boys had to kind of help her get to that point where she could crouch down and do her business. But, that is interesting observation.
Okay. Yeah, that's it for now. Thanks.
Mr. Weiss should be with us as well.
Yeah, greetings. I had an idea that just came to mind when you said that you only saw the word racism once in the whole book. You know, sometimes with these books, that the language has to be edited just so that the publisher will like it or will favor it. You know, Dr. John Henry Clark used to say that one of the ways you can tell how something's going to be written is if you can find out who published the book, and if you're able to, find out who financed the project itself, and that can help you determine how the language of a book is going to sound and how it's going to come out. Sometimes that's a way to tell how the language of a book is going to sound. Like if you know, for example, that certain publishers like words like caste system as against racism, and then you can tell that you know they tend to favor those kinds of writers that use those types of vague terms. That's one way to do it. I mean, you know, way of looking at it possibly.
Absolutely. I agree. This is a major publication. They got hardback, paperback, audiobook. I mean, this was on New York Times best-selling list. I can get the publishing information, but absolutely, I think white people had a lot to do with how this sounds and the marketing of the book. I think racists had a lot to do with it. Even I can give you another passage where I'm trying to write down where the word case system pops up, because that's just a term that I don't use. I feel like that's confusing and would not really be direct.
How does she spell it?
C-A-S-T-E.
You mean caste? That's how they say it. It's
caste.
Spelled case, but they say caste. It's like the caste system in India.
Cast, whichever.
Yeah.
To give another passage where this pops up, their every step was controlled by the meticulous laws of Jim Crow. That's another one. She used the term Jim Crow, not racism. A 19th century minstrel figure that would become shorthand for the violently enforced codes of the Southern caste system. The Jim Crow regime persisted from the 1880s to the 1960s. Some 80 years, the average lifespan of a fairly healthy man. I would put both of those. I hadn't even written down Jim Crow, but I would write that one down too. I think using the term Jim Crow, I think I've talked before. I think white people like films like The Help or 42, Driving Miss Daisy, these sorts of films, because it makes it seem like racism is something from the past. Like way long time ago, 150,000 years ago, your great-great-grandparents or whatever might have had a problem with racism, but not you. This is not something that we're dealing with now. And I remember one of our guests talked about you can do this with words too, where you're talking about a problem, and so you use these words, case system, Jim Crow, use these words to talk about a problem that we still have now, but it makes it seem like this is something from long ago. And that keeps getting suggested, I think, in the book, where she says the Jim Crow regime persisted from the 1880s to the 1960s. Well, if Jim Crow is gone, well, what can you explain Trayvon Martin? Can you explain Trevor Dooley? Can you explain Marissa Alexander if this caste system is not with us anymore?
That's a brilliant observation. That's even better than looking at who published it. But yeah, that's yeah. That was a nice shot right there. Yeah.
She said a fairly healthy man. She used the word fairly.
Yes, she did.
Okay.
1309 should be with us as well. 1309.
Greetings, everyone.
Greetings.
I wanted to. Oh, sorry. I wanted to say that I agree with what everyone is saying, and Gus had touched on a lot of things that I wrote down when I was listening to the audio book. And one thing I wanted to mention was that I think that in the writing, imagery is really important because, like, we associate the words and the images. So, for instance, I think in one part of the book that we listened to, she was comparing the black people that were part of this Great Migration to the people who came through Ellis Island, which I think is not a very good comparison. And also I wanted to say that white people are very slick with their words, and they tend to change definitions and words a lot. So, like, now they're saying, oh, there's two different types of immigration, voluntary and involuntary, and stuff like that. So, and also, if you go to her website, she talks. It says on there that how the blacks that came up to the north were trying to reach the American dream, and I think that's really deceptive.
Can you break down the last point about it being really deceptive? And if it's not asking too much, if you could get the first point, you said you didn't think it was a good comparison to try to contrast the so-called black people in the Great Migration to, I'm thinking, white people who immigrated through Ellis Island in New York, Statue of Liberty.
Yeah, because, well, I know that the black people that came to the States through the Middle Passage, they went to Sullivan Island, and then, like, the Chinese went to Angel Island, and then Ellis Island took in, like, the white European people. And I think that it's not a good comparison because it's kind of, I think, giving, like, false hope. Like, we're part of this equal protection that I don't think that we really have under this law, because they constantly say things in the law, that, you know, we should be afforded free and appropriate education, but then they track us into, like, you know, bad classes, and then there's, like, the pipeline, school with the pipeline, prison pipeline thing, and everything like that. It's just, and then, like, even the white Europeans that were coming here through Ellis Island, they were afforded so many more opportunities. And then the enslaved blacks, they weren't afforded that at all, and they had to go through a lot, and they still had to fight, and it's still a battle today. It's like the same stuff. Did I make my point clear?
I think that was pretty crystal. Very lucid to me.
And then also with the music and religion, to me it seems like a person could just rely on that and everything would be okay. But I think it's more about fighting the system and understanding it. I think that music and religion can sometimes be very distracting and derail us from, like, black liberation.
Good point. Good point. Has music popped up yet? Did I miss that? Did I fall asleep at the wheel? Has music been a big theme yet?
I thought that she mentioned it about jazz or something. Mm-hmm. But I know that they talked about the King James Bible. And that and then she was talking about how, like, a lot of the black people that came to the North provided, you know, like Toni Morrison, she was saying, and a bunch of other people.
B.B. King, that was one.
Yeah.
Good point. Excellent point. Excellent point.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to touch on more of what you were saying, I agree.
Oh, speak up, be more. Speak up.
Oh, can you hear me now?
That's better.
Okay. But just to touch more on what she was speaking of, about the whole migration from the south to the north, people automatically assumed that when non-white people were leaving from the South, that they were going to this quote unquote promised land, as if the North was a totally different universe. But people, of course, non-white people still experienced racism and even segregation in the North. It wasn't as bad as Jim Crow. Jim Crow wasn't in effect, but of course other racist laws were in effect and still are. So yeah, even touching on that word use of caste system or whatever, like that's, yeah, I definitely see where you're coming from. But people think that, yeah, things were just so lovely and like they were going to a whole different planet or something. But in the North, it was still a bunch of racism, of course. And I thought that the comparison was interesting between the North and the South when she talked about employment and single-parent households and things like that. And I don't think that she was trying to imply that people were better in the South or anything, of course, but that they were, in a sense, better off during segregation. And that's why she mentioned the employment and the single-parent households. I feel like integration messed us up because when we were segregated, we had our own, and it's because we kind of didn't have a choice. So, yeah, that's all I wanted to say about that. And then just one more thing. I like her style of writing thus far, the quotes and all. But, yeah, I do feel like, you know, there is some confusion, of course.
I think there are two folks who have not shared. The two people with a hand. One person is at a block number, and Mr. Demery 4 should be with us.
Yes, sir, I'm here.
If it's all right with you, Demery 4, can we do the female first?
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to be real quick. Yeah, thank you. I think I don't mean to cast aspersion on this lady, but from seeing her on C-SPAN and the hair and the way she talked and her presence and whatever, I kind of get the feeling that she might be white identified, and I was, kind of wondering if maybe she might be involved with a white man. I mean, I don't mean, to talk bad about her, but that's just kind of the way I felt when I first saw her, and when I read, parts of the book, concerning caste systems and Jim Crow and, stuff like that. That's all I wanted to say.
I don't want to know. I had that thought, and I don't want to know. If you want to find out, you can share. Feel free to share with listeners. I'm sure they would appreciate it, and that might even be, really helpful information. But she's really pretty. Like that would be a real drag. Have to keep that in mind the whole time we're reading the book. But feel free, if you find that out, I think that would be relevant information to share. But I'm not going to look because I don't want to know. I will hope for the best, though.
And I just want to say one more thing before you talk to the other guy. Consider down the road the book called American Frankenstein. I don't know if you've read it or if you've heard it before.
Oh, I got that. I got that.
You have that?
Yeah, I've been trying to get the white author on the program, Dr. C.O.W.S. Yeah, I think it was Dr. C.O.W.S.
Oh, it's a black author.
Really?
Yeah. Well, there are two different books of American Frankenstein, but the one I'm talking about is a black man. I just ordered it from Amazon, and I forgot his name. But he talks about in the introduction part of the book, because I read it on Amazon, and he said, as a black man growing up in middle class, I think he said Chicago. I'm not sure. Yeah, but because if it had been a white man who wrote that book, I would not have wanted to read it. Mm-hmm. But if you can go on Amazon and check it out.
Okay, I'll make sure I find the one that the black guy wrote. Oh, is it K.S. Kramer? Does that sound like it might be the guy? You don't
I'm not sure. I don't have the book yet. I just ordered it a few days ago, and I'm not sure. But I mean, you could read when you get time, you can read the introduction part, and you would know, which one was a black guy. Yeah.
Oh, this is it. Okay, this is the black one. So the one that the black guy wrote is K.S. Kramer, American Frankenstein: How the United States Created a Monster. This is the black male one. A white woman did write a book with the same title, which is also supposed to be very good. I've been told by Dr. Kevorkian, but don't get confused.
Yeah. Okay, I'm done.
Right on. Mr. Demery 4?
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Greetings, Gus, to the other callers. I hear some familiar voices that I hadn't heard in a while. It's always good to dialogue with the audience of the cows. I think this is a very important book, very well written, and as I was reading the first part of the book, my mind kept drifting back. I think it's a significant literary piece, and that she gets to the core of things, because my mind goes back, and this migration is very important because history records other great migrations, but failed to mention this one. The gold rush, the Oklahoma rush. She mentioned the English coming to America, seeking a new life, the Irish leaving the famine in Ireland. You know, history, white people have a way of omitting us from history. So I think her work is very important in that she brings this to light. A lot of the migration, when it began, I think some of our grandparents and our parents, depending on what your age are, were caught up in this, and it's significant on where we ended up because of this migration. I mean, at the end of it, around the 70s, I was leaving the South.
I'm sorry.
As I was leaving the South in the 70s, I went to Chicago. And so I left East Texas, and when she was painting that picture of the cotton fields and things, all that was in my memory banks, although I never experienced any of that, but it was there. And a significant part when she mentioned that the people that left Mississippi didn't see a beach until they had gotten to the north. Well, in Mississippi nowadays, they have beautiful beaches. And even if she had seen those beaches during those times, they would not have been allowed to participate in any of the activities up on the beaches. But I'll just hang in there, and when I have more to say, I'll jump in. Thank you for taking the call.
Right on. Appreciate the commentary. That is one thing I would say, particularly given what's happening in Detroit right now with the bankruptcy. I don't know. I know we do have some listeners in the Detroit area. Michael Eric Dyson was on several programs this week talking about that because he was born in Detroit, and he was tying it directly to racism and what white people have been saying about black people and the infestation of melanated folks in that area. I would say this is kind of interesting to keep this in mind while you're here, or I guess if you're paying attention to all that, what they're saying about Detroit, which is huge number of black people as a direct result of this. Also Chicago, same thing. What they're saying right now with, oh my God, black people, how could you talk about Trayvon Martin when you're killing each other in the dozens every week? And no one's upset about that. No one's out marching in the streets with everything that we went through. Also, I'm kind of, Miss Wilkerson, phenomenal scholarship, but I'm surprised. Maybe we just haven't got to it yet. The 1919 Chicago riots, white terrorism, white people going out and killing large numbers of black people. I'm I'm thinking that might pop up in the book. If it doesn't, I know that's in the archives. You can go back and Red Summer. We talked about that extensively, where there was a lot of rioting going on above the Mason-Dixon line. But I'm curious if that's going to pop up in here, because I would think that would have had a huge impact on the transplants in that area, even the black people that didn't experience it directly. Just knowing that took place there, when you have so many black people there, that would have to be something that's talked about, that would become a cultural reference point for people who live in that area. We have about 10 minutes before we start the second audio clip. Anybody have anything else they wanted to point out?
I looked up Isabel Wilkerson's spouse, and he's black. He's a professor at Hunter College in New York. I guess through the CUNY system. And she graduated from Howard, so.
Right on. Glad she's not married to a white person. That is phenomenal. Woohoo! Any other points folks want to get to before we get to the second portion of the audio?
I guess one last thing. I don't know if anyone said this. I know people are mentioning about Jim Crow, but there were Jim Crow laws in the North, and there was segregation in the schools in New Jersey, and I read that they didn't allow black people in Pittsburgh to attend the white schools. So when I noticed that many times there's a picture painted like, oh, well, the southern people are the ones that always owned slaves, and the northern people are the abolitionists, and they always fought for what was right. But the northerners, they profited from slavery. They benefited from slavery, too. And there were Quakers even that had owned slaves. So, all 13 colonies had slavery. So there was slavery in the North as well. So whenever people say these things or try to make it seem that way, I kind of just disregard them.
Right on. Good point. I would remind folks, you can hear the audio clip. It's on one of the compensatory broadcasts that we did a few months back at this point now. But you can even go online and find it. Dixie State College. This is in Utah, not Alabama or Georgia. This is in Utah, where they had slaves, had them out there picking cotton, and named a college after it to commemorate their presence. If you check the history of the state of Oregon, they didn't even allow black people in the state of Oregon for a long time, like another one that would not be below the Mason-Dixon line. And then even if you want to go more recent, in Boston, they have this on video where it got real ugly when they were trying to end, quote unquote, school segregation in Boston. And there's the photograph. It ended up being Photograph of the Year in Time magazine, where Ted Landsmark, he's a black male, he got speared. A white man, a racist, grabbed the American flag and speared him with it. It was the Photograph of the Year in Time magazine, but this was in Boston. And it got real nasty. White people committing violence about this. They did not want little nigger children with their young white, soon-to-be racists, or already racist, depending on their age. But there's a video with this white woman, and she says, we don't want to go to school with them. And, if you're going to make us do it, we're just going to pull our kids out of public schools and put them in private schools, and you can just let the niggers have it. This is on video. Where she's saying this is not from, the 1800s. This is like 1974. People that are clearly still, I was even thinking and looking at some of the videos of the people where she was in Georgia, Miss Wilkerson, doing the talk on this book. Some of the white people in the audience that are listening to her were responsible for why black people had to leave. And those white people are still practicing racism, white supremacy in the state of Georgia or wherever else that they're from. So, yeah, that's just one I would say keep in mind. Anyone, if you are confused about racism, white supremacy, thinking that, these white people are going to change, not do this anymore, that there are white people somewhere in the North or some mystical place where they don't subscribe to white supremacy, I would say you are confused. Anything else before we get started? Anything else?
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing. I don't know if very many people know, but most of the sundown towns are in the north or above the Mason-Dixon line. I just want to say that.
Good stuff. We will get to the second audio segment. Should get a little deeper into the book. As I said, this book is pretty long, so we're still haven't really even got started. Should be lots to go. I will keep my ears open for that word, caste system, other places where it's used. I think Jesus, music, those are key points that we talked about. And also areas that she's talking about. I know we have folks that are in a lot of these different places. Kind of keep that in mind. And how you think this impacted where you happen to be, or if you know of these places, or even what you hear about these places. I would say particularly for Detroit and Chicago, since these are areas that you're hearing a lot about, kind of listen to how this has evolved as you got large numbers of dark people coming into these areas and how this changed the way that racist man, racist woman operate in that area. We'll go ahead and get started. If folks that dialed in, since it is a lot of people, if you could mute your line just to keep the audio quality, I would appreciate it. If you can't mute, I can mute it for you, and then I'll just open everybody's line back up once the audio concludes. Thank you kindly. Context of White Supremacy, Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, segment number 2.
That's how come I know about the field, she would say, half a life later. Wherever he went, I went. When he wasn't nursing the cotton, he was tending the hogs. Sometimes the hogs ran off and got stuck in the creek water, swollen up after the gully washers that poured from the sky in the spring. Ida May followed her father down to the creek and watched him slosh in the water to save his drowning hogs. The rains brought moccasin snakes to the surface and left them alive on the creek bank when the water fell back. Ida May took sticks to pick them up with and played with them like toys. The rains beat down on Mississippi in May of 1923. The hogs went down to the creek and got stuck like they always did. But when her father slogged in after them, he had trouble bringing them in for all the floodwater that had risen up. He got sick from exposure and never recovered. He was 43 years old. He was diabetic, and the grown people said he was dead. But Ida May sat at the side of his bed and touched him, and he was warm. No doctor ever tended to him. There were no colored doctors around. The white ones were all in town, and the family would have had to meet them halfway, if they were going to see them at all, because the doctors in town didn't know the backwoods. Even if they had been inclined to come, the roads were too muddy from the rains to get through. Ida May thought the grown people should give him more time. Maybe he would come out of the spell he was in. Years later, she learned that educated people had a name for what her father appeared to be in. They called it a coma. But in that world and in that time, nobody could know for sure, and nobody would pay a little girl any attention, and so they set the date for the burial. She and her sisters Irene and Josie and Telma didn't have any shoes and went trailing behind their mother in their bare feet to the funeral. Nobody felt sorry for them, because most other people didn't have shoes either. When they closed the casket, Ida May thought for sure that her father was alive in there. "I still say today he wasn't dead," she would say 3/4 of a century later. At that time, they didn't have a way to know. Not long after the funeral, Ida May was sitting on the bin where they stored the hay and corn in an enclosure they called a crib. She looked up and saw what looked to be her father walk in. It was both startling and natural. He reached his hand out to her and took her hand in his and held it. When she realized what was happening, She ran out screaming and went to get Miss Theeney. "Daddy's in the crib," she cried. "I saw him." "Girl, get away from me with that lying," Miss Theeney said. "Joseph wouldn't scare you." "I held his hand just as plain as day," Ida May said. She never saw him again. As the summer wore on, it sank in that he wasn't coming back, and she started resenting the world and the people who had fathers. She started fighting and picking fights with people for no reason. School was out because colored children only went to school when they were not needed in the field. Ida May and other colored children in rural Mississippi didn't start school until the cotton was picked, which meant October or November, and they stopped going to school when it was time to plant in April. 6 months of school was a good year. She was still grieving when it came time to go back the next fall. She walked a mile of dirt road past the drying cotton and the hackberry trees to get to the one-room schoolhouse that one way or the other had to suffice for every colored child from 1st to 8th grade, the highest you could go back then if you were colored in Chickasaw County. The children formed a walking train to get there. It started with the child farthest away and picked up more children as it moved in the direction of the schoolhouse, until just about the whole school was in a cluster at the front door. Ida May was easily distracted by the nut trees along the way and had a hard time keeping up. "I be lagging behind, hollering and crying, 'cause they run off and leave me," she said. When the rains came and the water got too high for the children to pass through the hog wallows in places like where Ida May lived, the old people cut down a tree and trimmed the limbs so the children could cross over the log to get to school. The school was a narrow-framed cabin with wood benches and long windows, run by a teacher who was missing a leg. Amos Kirks was a source of unending curiosity and whispers among the children. He was of an age where he might have lost his leg in World War I, but none of the children knew for sure. He walked into the schoolroom, hobbling on crutches, in a suit with a stern face. He rotated the grades as if the room were a railroad switch yard, calling the 2nd and 3rd graders to the front when it was their turn, while the other children moved to the back to do their lessons. He towered above them and always wore a tie. But all the children could see was the left pant leg pinned up at the knee and air where a calf and foot should have been. One day Mr. Kirks came in, and his pant leg wasn't pinned at the knee. He had a new leg, but he couldn't walk on it like a real one. "He throwed the leg like it was tiresome to him," Ida May said, "and it would swing. He kind of swing it around." It was the talk of the schoolyard. "He finally got him a leg," the children whispered to each other. When Mr. Kirks wasn't looking, Ida May tried to tug at his pant cuff. "I sat side of him," Ida May said years later. "I try to do all I know how to get up under there and see how that leg looked. I sat by him, and I just rub and do. He couldn't feel it no way, and I could see the clear foot in the shoe." Ida May had to make sure Mr. Kirks didn't catch on. For the slightest infraction, Mr. Kirks would send some boys out to the woods to get branches off a tree. Then the child who was talking out of turn or drawing when he should have been listening was called up front for lashings with the switch. Ida May knew how that felt. In the fall after her father died, they were in the middle of a spelling lesson. One of the words was a city in the north called Philadelphia. Mr. Kirks called on Ida May to spell it. Some words the children turned into jingles to help them remember. For geography, it was "George eat o' gray rat at poor house yesterday." For Mississippi, it was M-I crooked letter I crooked letter I humpback I. Ida May had heard about the North, but didn't know Philadelphia or any ditties for it. She stumbled over the word. Mr. Kirks thought she was acting up. He told some boys to go out to the woods and get him a switch. He held the branches over the fire and told Ida May to come up front. He told her to bend over. He drew his arm back, and in front of all the other children, he whipped her. And each time the switch snapped her back, he shouted a letter. P-H-I-L-A-D-E-L-P-H-I-A. She was hurt to be singled out that day. She wasn't saying she hadn't done a devilish thing in her life. She was just thinking to herself all she had done was miss the word, and the whipping wasn't called for. After school, she went up to Mr. Kirk's and told him so. "If I had a daddy, you wouldn't have whooped me," Ida May told him. "You whoop me 'cause I don't have a daddy." He never whipped her again. She seemed to be more aware of how life was harder now. Things she wouldn't have paid attention to before, she seemed to be noticing. On her way to and from school, she passed the farm of a man named Mr. Bafford. His wife had left him to raise their son by himself, and he seemed to take out his grief on those around him. He had a yard full of trees that bore more fruit than he could ever consume or pick fast enough to sell. The peaches and apples and pears were some of the biggest and sweetest in the bottoms. They ripened and fell to the ground, and still he dared anyone to come onto his land to get any. Ida May figured out a way to get some. She stopped by and talked with Mr. Bafford and made sure to keep him talking. And if he ever looked away, she reached down and slipped a pear or an apple into her dress. "You know they fall off. He could have give us some of them," she said. "Every time I got a chance, I got me some." It was approaching Christmas, the first Christmas since her father had died. One day when Ida May stopped to see Mr. Bafford, she started wondering aloud whether Santa Claus was going to come this year, what with her daddy gone and all. "That's the first thing they teach y'all, a lie," Mr. Bafford said. "Ain't no such thing as Santa Claus." It crushed Ida May to hear him say that. She was 10, and even in the gaunt world she lived in, she still believed in Santa Claus. She started crying when Mr. Bafford said it. "That taken all the joy out of life then," she said. There would be no Christmas that year. "I'm not able to pay Santa Claus to come to us," Miss Theeney told the girls. Ida May began to resent everybody now. She was getting into more scrapes, coming and going to school, and getting ornery without cause. A boy named Henry Lee Babbitt used to ride his horse to school every day and brought corn to feed him with. Ida May lived farther than Henry Lee did and had to walk. Something got into Ida May one day, and she told Henry Lee she was going to set his horse loose. She went up to the horse and reached for the bridle bit that tied the horse to the hitching post. "Tom, you bet not turn my horse loose," Henry Lee said. "What if I do?" Ida May shot back. "You do, I beat your brains out." The two of them stood there next to the horse, Ida May holding the bridle bit and threatening to pull it off, and Henry Lee trying to keep her from doing it. "I double dog dare you to pull that bridle," Henry Lee said. "You take that there, and you take a nickel off a dead man's eye." She yanked the bridle off the horse and dropped it to the ground. "And down the road we went, me and the boy there fighting," she said years later. Henry Lee reached down and grabbed the bridle bit from where she left it and raised it up against her. "He took it and nearly beat me to death," she said. "I got a knot in back of my head now where he hit me with that bridle bit." Without her half-brothers and her father around, she was on her own. "You had to fight," she would later say. "Them boys would mess with you. You couldn't whoop 'em, but you did what you could." Within a few years, the boys would not want to fight with her anymore. They wanted to sit and hold her hand and talk. The spark that made her fight them drew the quiet ones to her when it came time for courting. She was 15 when two in particular started showing up at the front porch with those intentions. On a Sunday after service in the summer of 1928, the church mothers at New Hope Baptist set out the hot platters of cornbread and collards and salted hams. Whoever made the collards worried if they were tender enough. Whoever baked the pound cake prayed that people would favor her cake over somebody else's potato pie. It was the time of the year they called the lay-by, when the people left the cotton alone and waited for it to sprout. The people had turned the benches up and spread the food on the tables outside the little frame church. They called the event Children's Day, in the spirit of Men's Day and Women's Day other times of the year. An event like this was all there was on colored people's off day in the backwoods of Chickasaw County. People came in from Buena Vista, or Buny as they called it, and from over near Houston, the county seat, and even Okolona, arriving in their wagons and surreys. These were the times when sharecroppers and servants could recede into a world of their own making, where Jim Crow didn't bother to enter. They could forget that there was such a thing as colored or white, and just be. Sundays like this turned the churchyard into courting grounds for marriageable girls, and young men looking for wives or diversions. George Gladney showed up with a bunch of other young men from across the creek in somebody's old Model T Ford. He was 22, stern-faced and serious, even then. He wasn't no smiling man, Ida May said. He was from around Buny, which was 7 or 8 miles south of Van Vliet. He was among the last of 12 to 15 children. No one alive knows for sure how many there were. His father had children by several wives, who died young, or at least before he did. George's mother died before he acquired much to remember her by. He was raised by an older brother, Willie, and the weight of his circumstances seemed to show in his face. It was getting to the time when he should settle down, so he walked up to Ida May that afternoon. She was eating on the grass in her Sunday dress. He introduced himself, but she didn't pay him much attention. Her mind was on someone else, and she was mad at the moment. A boy by the name of Alfonso Banks had shown up at church that day with another girl. Alfonso was the love of her short life. He was friends with her brothers, older and sure of himself, in a way that drew the girls to him. No one had really taken her anywhere her whole life, and she felt grown up and free when he did. Excitement seemed to follow him, even when he had nothing to do with it. One time he took her to a church revival, which was the country equivalent of a night on the town. It was Alfonso and Ida May's big sister Irene, and another young man who was escorting Irene that night. They drove up to the church and got out of the car, all of them young and giddy. They attracted the attention of a man named Bebe, who had designs on Ida May's sister. He saw them and got enraged. "Who is this out here laughing?" he said to them. They ignored him. They started up the steps, and as they walked toward the church door, Bebe pulled out a gun and shot at them 6 times, aiming at Irene or her escort or both. He was a bad shot and didn't hit anybody, but it was exciting and the talk of the woods, and further proved to Ida May that Alfonso Banks sure knew how to show a girl a good time, even though he had nothing to do with it. She had been out with Alfonso enough to feel a kind of ownership that was implied, if not outright said. When she saw Alfonso come to Children's Day with another girl, she went up and spoke her mind. "What'd you bring her here for?" Ida May said. "I brought her for Children's Day." "Mm-hmm." Something rose up in her. She took the umbrella in her hand and knocked it across his head. "Boy, I loved that boy," she said years later. "And he come bringing that girl over there, and I hit him all across the head. My mother hit me with a poker when I got home. Everybody was talking about it. You know how folks talk. Said I was wrong, had no business hitting him across the head on church grounds. When George showed up that day, she was distracted and didn't give his new face much thought. But he seemed to have made up his mind about her and started coming by her house on Sunday afternoons, giving her time to see the light. He endured the stone face of Miss Theeney's disapproval and the teasing curiosity of Josie and Talma to spend time with Ida May. When he felt he was on firm enough ground to do so, he began making noises about the other young men, David McIntosh, Alfonso Banks, and another one, Freddie McClendon. He didn't like them coming around, and it showed on his face. The other men must have noticed an intensity of purpose in George that they could not have fully understood, and they avoided running into him. It got to the point where during his final visits, David McIntosh, sensing the hour growing late, would say, "Well, I guess I better go for Gladney get here." George's steadfastness won her over, and she finally agreed to marry him and be free of life under her mother. But she and George had to keep it to themselves. Miss Theeney wouldn't allow it if she knew. She never liked any of the boys courting Ida May, and she didn't like George. "He's old enough for your daddy," Miss Theeney used to say of George, who was by now 23, to Ida May's 16. In the middle of October 1929, George made arrangements for them to run off and get married. He found a preacher and a place near Buney, outside her mother's circle. He went into Houston and bought a yellow dress with a blouson waist low on the hip, as was the style back in the 20s, for Ida May to wear. The morning of October 14th, 1929, Ida May fed the chickens and did her chores like any other day and kept a lookout for George to come and take her to a new life. But before he could get there, a neighbor man pulled up to their cabin and went in to see her mother. "I heard your daughter get married in Buney tonight," the man said. Miss Theeney started cursing and went looking for Ida May. Ida May knew she would pay for plotting under her mother's nose. She ran and hid under the bed and wondered how she would get out when George came for her. Now that Miss Theeney knew George was on his way, Miss Theeney would be ready for him. Josie and Talma and Miss Theeney looked out in the crib and out by the cows and called out to her in the little wood house and couldn't find her. The search for Ida May must have touched something in Miss Theeney. Something must have told her it was time for Ida May to leave her. She got through cursing, and Ida May felt safe to come out. Miss Theeney went up to her second daughter and told Ida May her decision about the wedding. "Well, I'll give you tomorrow," Miss Theeney said, "providing all us can go with you." The next day, October 15th, 1929, they all went to the minister's house. Ida May put on the yellow dress with the blouson waist that George had chosen for her. The yard was filled with people as they stood on the porch steps, and George Gladney and Ida May Brandon were declared man and wife. "We wish you much joy," the people in the yard said. George took her to the Ed Pearson plantation a few miles away, where he would sharecrop cotton and she would learn to be a wife. 2 weeks later, something called the stock market crashed, and things would get harder than they ever knew they could. Because if the planters suffered, so much more would the sharecroppers under them. An invisible hand ruled their lives, and the lives of all the colored people in Chickasaw County, and the rest of Mississippi, and the entire South for that matter. It wasn't one thing, it was everything. The hand that determined that white people were in charge, and colored people were under them and had to obey them like a child in those days had to obey a parent, except there was no love between the two parties, as there is between a parent and child. Instead, there was mostly fear and dependence, and hatred of that dependence, on both sides. The particulars of all this eluded Ida May. White people were everywhere around her, but they were separate from her, in a separate schoolhouse on separate land on the other side of a firewall that kept white and colored from occupying the same sidewalk. Colored people had to step off the curb when they passed a white person in town, and if the minutest privilege could be imagined, the ruling class claimed it. Ida Mae lived only a few towns away from Calhoun City, Mississippi, where there were white parking spaces, the ones closest to the bank in the town square, and colored parking spaces on the other side of the street, well into the 1950s. There were no signs for them. It was just the work of the invisible hand. Neither Miss Theeney nor George ever took Ida Mae into Houston or Okolona, where white people transacted their business affairs, and growing up, Ida Mae had few direct dealings with white people. When she did, it was in the service of them and their whims, whether she wished it or not, and in the short time she was in their presence, it seems they made sure to remind her what her place was in their eyes, even when she was too young to understand it. She was about 6 or 7 years old when one day her father told her to take a small section of plow to get sharpened at the blacksmith. That way he wouldn't have to quit working to go himself. She rode the horse down the dirt path, through the hackberry trees to the blacksmith's house. The blacksmith was a kind and middle-aged white man with 2 grown sons. The blacksmith pulled the plow sweeps off the horse and went into the back to sharpen them. As Ida Mae stood waiting, the blacksmith's 2 sons came up to her. They were in their 20s, and with their father occupied, were looking to have some fun. "We gon' put her in the well," they said to each other, and laughed. Each man took an arm, and as she screamed for them to let her go, they dragged her to a well with a wall around it, and dangled her over the mouth of it. Ida Mae could see down the black hole of the well, her legs hanging over the rim. She fought and kicked and screamed at the men to let her go. She looked around and saw nobody there to help her. The men's father was still working on the plow bits. The men watched her squirm and laughed at the sight of her squirming. They held her over the well until the fun wore off. Then they put her down, and she ran to where the blacksmith was and waited for him to come out with the freshly sharpened sweeps. Her father used to send her there all the time. After that, he never sent her any more. When it came down to it, there was nothing he could do to keep it from happening again. Decades later, she would think about how they could have dropped her, even by accident, and how she would have died, and nobody would have known where she was or how she'd gotten there. "They wouldn't have never told," she said. Ida Mae soon discovered that when it came to white people, there were good ones and bad ones like anything else, and that she had to watch them close to figure out the difference. She was too good-natured to waste energy disliking them no matter what they did, but looked upon them as a curiosity she might never comprehend. She learned to give them the benefit of the doubt, but not be surprised at anything involving them. This alone probably added decades to her life. A white lady named Miss Julie McClenna lived across the pasture, and she was nice to Ida Mae. After Ida Mae's father died, Miss McClenna paid Ida Mae to gather up eggs in the hen house. Sometimes she took her into town to help her carry eggs to sell. She gave Ida Mae live chickens and leftover food, knowing that Ida Mae's mother had just been left a widow. After school, Ida Mae walked a mile to the big house across the pasture to gather eggs for Miss McClenna in the evenings. She always hoped for a lot of eggs. If there were too many for Miss McClenna to carry herself, she would take Ida Mae into Okolona with her. It was the only chance Ida Mae got to go into town. Ida Mae gathered more than usual one time, and Miss McClenna took her into Okolona to help her sell them to the white people in town. They delivered the eggs to customers' houses, straight to their doors, and Miss McClenna had Ida Mae carry the basket of eggs for her. The day had gone well, until they knocked on one woman's door to make a delivery. Ida Mae stood with the basket behind Miss McClenna as Miss McClenna prepared to step inside. "You can't bring that nigger in," the woman said from her front door as soon as she saw Ida May. Miss McClenna knew what that meant. She motioned for Ida May to go to the back door to deliver the eggs, while Miss McClenna stepped inside to complete the transaction. On the way back home, Miss McClenna seemed unsettled by it. "Did you hear what she called you?" Miss McClenna asked Ida May. "Yeah, but I ain't paid no attention," Ida May said. "They call you so many names, I never pay it no attention." The incident jarred Miss McClenna. The hardware of reality rattled her, as the artist Carrie Mae Weems would say decades later of such interactions. What few people seemed to realize, or perhaps dared to admit, was that the thick walls of the caste system kept everyone in prison. The rules that defined a group's supremacy were so tightly wound as to put pressure on everyone trying to stay within the narrow confines of acceptability. It meant being a certain kind of Protestant, holding a particular occupation, having a respectable level of wealth or the appearance of it, and drawing the patronizingly appropriate lines between oneself and those of lower rank, of either race in that world. An attorney's wife in Alabama, for instance, was put on notice one day at a gathering at her home for the upper-class women in her circle.
This is the end of disc number 1. Please insert disc number 2. This is disc number 2.
It meant being a certain kind of Protestant, holding a particular occupation, having a respectable level of wealth or the appearance of it, and drawing the patronizingly appropriate lines between oneself and those of lower rank, of either race in that world. An attorney's wife in Alabama, for instance, was put on notice one day at a gathering at her home for the upper-class women in her circle. Between the hors d'oeuvres and conversation, one of the club women noticed, for the first time apparently, a statuette of the Virgin Mary on a cabinet in the hostess's living room. The guest cattily remarked upon it. Why, she never knew that the hostess and her family were Catholics. The attorney's wife was shaken by the accusation and quickly replied that, of course not. They were Methodists, and she thought everyone knew that. She only had the statuette because she happened to like it. But after the party was over and the guests were gone, the accusation haunted her, and she fretted over the implication that she might be seen as a member of a lesser tribe. That day, the attorney's wife took down the statuette of Mary that she liked so much and put it away for good. She could not afford even the appearance of having stepped outside the bounds of her caste. Neither could Miss Julie McClenna. As far as Ida May knew, Miss McClenna never sold eggs to that lady again. But that was also the end of her brief employment with Miss Julie McClenna and the end of the trips into Okolona. "She never did take me no more after that," Ida May said. In the Bottoms, where Ida May grew up, it was a crazy enough world that they could almost time the weekends by a white farmer who lived down the road. He was fine when he was sober and actually liked colored people, but he got drunk on Fridays and came staggering on his old horse to the colored people's cabins. They could hear the hoof steps and hollering as he rode in, waving his gun. "I'm coming through," he shouted. Grown people dropped their buckets and went running. Children hid under the cabins in the dirt floor between the stilts while he huffed and cussed and tried to smoke them out. "I'ma shoot y'all," he hollered. "I'ma kill y'all." There was always a commotion and a panic whenever he came through. It could happen day or night. There was never much warning, and they had to scramble to escape his ragged gunshots. Then they had to lie perfectly still. We'd run under the house, and wherever he hear a bump, he would shoot, Ida Mae said. One day when he came through, Ida Mae was outside and couldn't get under the house in time. Josie and Talma had scattered already, and she didn't see where they had gone. The man had wobbled off his horse and was coming through, firing his gun. A barrel of cornmeal was right next to her, and she saw it and jumped inside. She sank into the grit cushion of meal with her chin digging into her knees. All the while the man hollered and grunted around her, and the bullets made the pinging noises of metal against tin. She pulled the top over her head and tried not to breathe. She stayed in the barrel until the shooting and the cussing stopped. He was drunk and a bad aim, and never actually hit anybody as far as Ida Mae knew. No sheriff or police were ever called in. There would have been no point in calling. And so the drunk farmer could go on shooting and scaring the Brandons and other colored people in the Bottoms whenever he felt like it. He called himself having fun, Ida Mae said. As she grew older, she learned that there was more to the Southern caste system than verbal slights and the antics of a crazy white farmer. In the summer of 1926, when she was 13, a cloud passed over the grown people, and it showed on their faces. She could overhear them whispering about something that had happened in town, some terrible thing they didn't want the children to know about. It had to do with 2 colored boys, the Carter brothers, as she heard it, and a white woman. They said something to the white lady, she said. And as best as Ida Mae could make out, the white people had taken the boys and hanged them in Okolona that morning. Ida Mae would always remember it, because that was the day her cousin was born, and they named the baby Thenia after Ida Mae's mother. The grown people wept in their cabins. After the funeral, the surviving Carters packed up and left Mississippi. They went to a place called Milwaukee and never came back. In 3 years' time, Ida Mae and George would move to the Pearson plantation, and things would unfold in such a way that Ida Mae would eventually follow the Carters up north. Although she didn't see how it might apply to herself at the time, the Carter migration was a signal to Ida Mae that there was, in fact, a window out of the asylum.
Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial is 760-569-7676. And the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. Should have more than 35 minutes left, so there should be ample time if you would like to share. The number again, 760. 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. Just in the spirit of white Jesus, because that was one that was mentioned quite a few times, I did want to rewind to read one passage that stuck out related to white Jesus. All the folks that hung on the line, your lines are open. Anybody else that would like to participate, just press *6 and I will get you immediately. The passage, I should have said this at the beginning. If you would like the book so you can follow along as we go, I can get you the ebook version. I guess I could have just put that on my Facebook page or what have you. But if you would like the hard copy of the book so you can follow along as we go, I can do that. At any rate, the passage relating to Christmas really stuck out to me. It was approaching Christmas, the first Christmas since her father had died. One day, when Ida Mae stopped to see Mr. Bafford, she started wondering aloud whether Santa Claus was going to come this year, what with her daddy gone and all. That's the first thing they teach y'all. A lie, Mr. Baffert said. Ain't no such thing as Santa Claus. It crushed Ida Mae to hear him say that. She was 10, and even in the gaunt world she lived in, she still believed in Santa Claus. She started crying when Mr. Baffert said it. That taken all the joy out of life then, she said. There would be no Christmas that year. I'm not able to pay Santa Claus to come to us, Miss Theeney told the girls. Ida Mae began to resent everybody now. She was getting into more scrapes, coming and going to school, and getting ornery without cause. Ornery is one of my favorite words. Gus T Renegade has been branded as ornery on many occasions, but I would say that for myself and Ida Mae, any non-white person in the known universe, you have more reasons than could ever be counted to be as ornery as you would like to be, as long as the system of white supremacy exists. We should have with us Be More, the caller at 1309, Mr. Demry 4, and our caller who dialed in from a block number or what have you. All the people that dialed in with a hand up, your line should be open. Feel free to participate. Or I guess we should start the person who has not shared at all. I guess we should start there. The person who dialed in from a block number who hasn't participated. Did you have anything you wanted to share? Let's see. The person, are you with us? The person that dialed in, it's showing up as a Gmail. Maybe you used your Gmail as your account thing. Okay. Not hearing. I will try again, see if we can get your line. The other folks that dialed in with a hand up, if you had something you wanted to share, feel free.
I thought it was interesting that she was talking about good white people and bad white people, and the two characters in the book that were supposedly good white people didn't come to her aid. And also how she was saying that she would give white people the benefit of the doubt. I think that's a really dangerous thing to do because speaking for myself, I've done it in the past, and white people don't see us black people as individuals, and they don't give us the benefit of the doubt. So it really puts us at a disadvantage if we take that stance.
Amen. Ashe. Amen. 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 I'm going to reserve comments so that other folks can feel free to share whatever they would like. The person, I'm having some trouble. The person that dialed in with the G words, I don't know if I'm having trouble. I'm opening your line, but it's looking like, I don't know if you're able to share or not. The person that dialed in from, if you use the flash phone to dial in, like you went to tiny.cc/1race. If you use that, if you want to hang up and just dial back in, we can get you on the line. I'm not sure why it's not opening your line up, but all the other folks should be with us and free to share. Your lines are all open. Okay, cool. Just dial back in and I'll get your hand. But the other four people, I think, Be More and all the other lines that I called out, your line should be open. Feel free.
I also took note of how the loss of her father affected her, with them saying that she started resenting those with fathers and picking fights and etc. It made me think of the guest you had on. I can't recall her name, but she would discuss fatherless daughters. Made me think of her. And then another thing that I took note of is how she talked about her teachers and how they could quote unquote lash you with the switch. I believe her teacher was non-white, but I thought back to my childhood. I was in first grade. I got paddled by a white woman, my principal, because another white woman who was my substitute at the time said I looked at her wrong and was therefore disrespectful. So yeah, I definitely experienced racism a lot, being from a predominantly white town, but first grader, paddled, never forgot it. But I'll stop for now.
Janetta Rose Barris, the guest, black female, she was on talking about whatever happened to Daddy's Little Girls, the impact of fatherlessness on black females, black children specifically. I thought of that as well. That whole passage where she talked about how unruly she became after the loss of her father, so that should sound very familiar to a lot of folks. What we hear presently about the conduct of young children who don't have an intact family structure, as no victim of racism, white supremacy does. The person who dialed in from 7892 should be with us as well as all the other callers. I did, since they ended with Milwaukee and they just had the conviction of Mr. Spooner, for Darius Simmons, the 13-year-old black male who was shot and killed in Milwaukee. Since we don't have a caste or caste system anymore, that would be another one to explain how Darius Miles, 13-year-old, can be shot and killed on camera. And I think he said he was aiming for his brother, too. Could have been two. Two black males dead instead of one. 7892 should be with us as well as all the other callers.
Greetings, this is Universal Jones. I was the one with the free HD call-in issues. But B More, it sounds like she picked up where I was going to go with the passage on missing the father, because I thought that there was a very significant statement she made when she said, "You wouldn't whip me if my daddy was here, or if I had a daddy." I thought that was pretty good, pretty important statement. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting, in the words of Mr. Nero, white people kill for fun. And when she said he came through that town shooting on the horse for fun, that's what, came to mind for me. And just the terrorism. And one white man on a horse came through and terrorized the whole community, so to say. Had, kids hiding under porches, in barrels holding breaths. Like, that's pretty, some significant trauma that was going on. So I found that very, very interesting. And it hasn't stopped. That's it for now.
White people kill for fun. Any other comments from the folks listening in?
When I heard of the passage that the caller just mentioned about the guy riding on the horse and terrorizing people, I thought of that saying, a drunk man's words are a sober man's thoughts. And from my experience, I find that white people and alcohol, when it mixes, they start to call people that look like me nigger, and it's not a good situation. So I just avoid that at all costs. I just try to stay away. And another thing I wanted to mention was in the book she mentions the invisible hand, and I thought that alluded to Adam Smith, the invisible hand in the market. And also it shows that racism, white supremacy is a system, and that it really, if you think about it, what it boils down to is that it's all about wealth and power and maintaining that wealth and power.
when I heard that phrase, the invisible hand, I think what you just mentioned with Adam Smith, I think that's accurate. I think it's one of those. I don't think it's either or. I think it's both. A reference to Adam Smith as well as I think the pattern that I've seen thus far. And I mean, we really have not read very much of this book at all. We haven't even read 10% of the book yet. So, I mean, there's lots more to come. So this might not even fit the rest of the pattern as we continue. But not indicting white people as a collective for this, what she's labeling a caste system, case system, the system of white supremacy, where the invisible hand, as though it is not all of these white people, including Miss McLeana, this white woman that she thought was so cool, Adame thought was so nice to her and allowed her to sell eggs until she got called a nigger that one day. I think that's another way of not just directly saying that white people are responsible for this. It's all of the white people here who make up the rules, the codes that govern what's happening here, whether it's a drunk white man on a horse or a white person who is nice and will allow you to do certain things that maybe other white people would not allow, or white people who for fun would be willing to kill you and toss you in a well and never mention your name again. This is not the invisible hand. This is the hand of racist man, racist woman, racist child, and our inability or unwillingness to honestly acknowledge that, I think, is one of the main reasons we have not solved this problem. I will mute my line. I wanted to get this passage in as well to the point. And I see we have, I'll get the caller. I just wanted to get this passage in to make that point. This is one of those passages where I think back before I was codified, I would have been really upset and I would have had a Cornel West moment where I was name calling another victim and blaming another victim of racism as opposed to attributing all blame to racist man, racist woman, racist child. This passage, she writes, "What few people seem to realize, or perhaps dared admit, was that the thick walls of the caste case system kept everyone in prison. Everyone, not just black people, everyone. The rules that defined the group's supremacy were so tightly wound as to put pressure on everyone trying to stay within the narrow confines of acceptability. It meant being a certain kind of Protestant, holding a particular occupation, having a respectable level of wealth, or the appearance of it, and drawing the patronizingly appropriate lines between oneself and those of lower rank of either race in that world." Just that paragraph right there is one of the ones where I could say, I can see why white people would love a book like this. Dr. Marimba Ani's term, universalism. Everybody is a victim of the system of white supremacy. I can use one of my words for the year. That is just bunkum. That is total malarkey. That is exactly what racist man, racist woman, racist child want us to think so that they can remain in power, dominating and terrorizing us forever. We're just victims of this too. The invisible hand has got us in the cell with you all. And I'll mute my line. The person that dialed in 1922, your line should be open as well, along with all the other callers. 1922 should be with us as well.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
I just can anyone clarify for me those two white males who took her by the well? Did they rape her? I was a bit confused about that.
No, I didn't see where there was a rape. I'll go back and look at the passage now, but I don't think they raped her. Did anyone get that? Did anyone understand that they raped her?
No, I thought that they just took her and dangled her over a well. And then that made her scared, yeah.
Oh, okay. Thanks for clarifying that. I think my only comment was, I think Universal Jones already made the the statement. When that drunk white man was on the horse, she made the comment that they couldn't call the cops because it would be, I forget the word she used, but I think it was in the vein of saying it wouldn't make sense or it wouldn't matter anyway, you know. And I was just thinking, you know, this is what domination looks like, you know. That was my only comment. Thank you.
Absolutely. She wrote about that incident. I want to get the other people dialed in, but she just really quickly, she wrote about that incident. Her father used to send her there all the time. After that, he never sent her anymore. When it came down to it, there was nothing he could do to keep it from happening again. Impotence. Decades later, she would think about how they could have dropped her, even by accident, how she would have died and nobody would have known where she was or how she'd gotten there. They wouldn't have never told, she said. Ida Mae soon discovered that when it came to white people, man. Yeah, this was another one of those. I was like, oh man, I can see why racists would really dig this book and want to promote it. Ida Mae soon discovered that when it came to white people, there were good ones and bad ones like anything else, and that she had to watch them close to figure out the difference. She was too good-natured to waste energy disliking them no matter what they did. Woo! She was too good-natured to waste energy disliking them no matter what they did, but looked upon them as a curiosity she might never comprehend. She learned to give them the benefit of the doubt, but not be surprised at anything involving them. This alone probably added decades to her life. The person that dialed in, or the two people that dialed in, I'm just going to, because there's too many people that called in, I'm just going to be, if you dial in and put a hand up, your line is open. So everybody that dialed in with a hand up, your line is open. The two people that just joined us.
Well, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
You know, I was just noticing that that whole statement about the caste system, so-called, you know, affecting both white people and black people. I can remember hearing Dick Gregory making a certain analysis that was similar to that in some of his speeches. And I always found that to be very confusing whenever I would listen to him in some of his speeches, because he would allude to that a lot. And he would do it repeatedly. Yeah. There's something that came to my mind when I heard that statement.
Yeah, could I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of was that executive notice of this section.
Getting some background noise. I don't know if that's you or not. I'm trying to. Okay, that's you. The caller in Alabama. That's your line. I don't know if you're on speakerphone or something, but if you could kill the, because it's hard to hear you. So if you can calm the background noise down. Thank you, sir. Your line is open.
Can you hear me better now?
Perfect.
Okay, yeah, that was my air condition, but, yeah, one thing I noticed, at the last section that was read, when they was talking about they had revival, and how kind of church was about everything, like, there was like a night out on the town, and, it probably, I would see that probably towns still like that. Especially like in a lot of rural areas and stuff like that. But I think the majority of Americans, we probably can't understand how church was everything for them. And it's to the point now where sometimes I'll say rightfully so, but then sometimes I'll say unnecessarily so. But church gets knocked a lot, you know what I'm saying? But it was like, because I remember what my grandma was telling me, it was like a meeting place when things went wrong in the community. That's when they went to go talk about things and just everything. It kind of reminded me of how she described church when she was growing up. But I'm just my ass.
Oh yeah, I think White Jesus is going to dominate this whole book. If this is going up, the major chunk of the migration period, she dates it, I think, from World War I, which is if you want to call 1915-ish, between 1915, 1920 through 1970, that kind of 55-year chunk of time, white Jesus is going to be a dominant character. So yeah, just take notes as he pops up throughout the narrative and how that impacts their understanding or what they're saying about white people, what they're saying about racism. I think Ida Mae, this black female, one of the first major characters, you've already heard her talking about what a devastating blow Christmas and there's no Santa Claus, her finding that out. And then you see her down the line saying that, you know, she's giving white people the benefit of the doubt and they're good ones and bad ones. I would say there's probably a connection there. I wanted to ask the female caller who was saying that she didn't think the comparison between white or European immigrants and the Great Migration, black people leaving the South, she didn't think that comparison was accurate. What would you say if Miss Wilkerson or anyone just took the position, well, what she was attempting to do was to show the similarities with regards to white people saying that, you know, they don't understand our humanity, they don't understand what we've gone through, that she was making an effort to relate to them and show how there are a lot of similarities. The so-called Irish, them coming here after the potato famine, that's pretty similar to the same thing that black people did, and just a way to get white people to identify with victims of racism. What would your response to that be?
My response would be that it's not the same because from what I've studied, I guess the immigration history and everything, each ethnic group that comes to the States, I see that they're pretty much hazed, lack of a better term, and they have to go through a bit of hardship, and then they kind of, the white supremacists expand the ranks of what whiteness is, and then they're just kind of pulled in, and then they become the foot soldiers of white supremacy. Because in order for the system to exist and maintain, they need to have more and more white people. And they need to have, I guess, this illusion that, everybody else is able to make it. They have Asian immigrants come here, they're able to make it. You have Arab immigrants and all these other ethnic groups, and they're able to make it. And it's set up so it makes it look like it's black people that have the problem and pushes the responsibility off of the white people. And I don't know how long we as black people have to keep working in order to even get the same rights. I mean, these other groups, they just come here, they didn't have to go through all these hardships and be terrorized, and we go through all of that. We built this country, and no acknowledgement, no respect, and I don't see any change in behavior in the future, looking at the track record. So that's what I have to say.
Ashe.
We have about 12 minutes left in the broadcast. So if any last thoughts, or if anybody that's listening, if you have not shared, if you think there's something you want to get in before we conclude, get your hand up. You got about 12 minutes, which should be plenty, but just don't wait till the last minute. That Carter brothers lynching that she talked about towards the end, where she said she was learning that there was more to the Southern caste system than verbal slights and the antics of a crazy white farmer. That's another one I would say. This is not crazy, racist white farmer. I think that might be in Red Summer. I think we might have talked about that before on the program. I have to go and grab that book. Cameron McWhirter, Red Summer, talking about the summer of 1919. I'm going to have to go grab that book to see if he talks about it, but it's sounding familiar to me. I'm going to have to go and double check to see if we have talked about that previously. I don't know what the conclusion of the book is going to be by the time you have moved through all of this and you get to the 1970s. But one of the thoughts that jumped out, I was reminded Dr. Cambon, where he talks about how white people enjoy black pathology and seeing us suffering, everything that they've inflicted on us, and us attempting to respond and our failed attempts to vanquish racism, white supremacy, that they enjoy that. And I could see how for white people, it's a well-written book, it's well-researched. They get to see these are their grandparents and uncles and what have, and grandmothers who are running around on a horse, terrorizing a whole black town and holding a small black child over a well. These are their relatives. These are not strangers. These are not people. We're not talking about folks from, another universe. 1919 is not that long ago. That's just a few generations. I could see why white people would get a lot of enjoyment out of this book. Even at times, I could see how for a racist, this would be like racial theater. I get a vivid depiction of how we stomped out black people 100 years ago, the way the plantation was run then in comparison to now. I can look at Trayvon Martin or Darius Miles, continued terrorism against black children. And then I can, continue with, look at what granddad was doing back then, riding around on his horse shooting. Yeah, I mean, that's the same thing. Cody Ingham, Frederick Germain Carter, James Craig Anderson, same thing.
Not to forget Mr. Shavers. What the Shavers guy name? The Arkansas, what was his first name? John Burrow. That shot in the head while he was handcuffed at the back of the police car. They said it was suicide.
Even forgotten all about that. And that was, I think, about a year ago. This is about a year ago right now. I remember that case. I have to look online to get his name really quick. Chavis Carter, if my memory is accurate. Chavis Carter.
Yeah, I know it was some Chavis, something I forgot. Yeah, okay. But just like you say, terrorists. They, I guess they try to appeal better, but still the same type of tactic. And the guy wasn't arrested for shooting in the black area. You know what I'm saying? Kind of like the same thing. Well, the guy was not prosecuted. I say the only thing now, at least they give us a dog and pony show for the kangaroo court, and then later on say, I didn't mean to let him off. I didn't understand what was going on. I think he's guilty, but he wasn't guilty at first. It's ridiculous. People lie.
I'm going to have to make a conscious effort to make sure that I'm picking out things that I think are constructive or helpful or reveal truth about racism, white supremacy, since we're going to be spending a lot of time on this book. And if it continues in this vein, I can see where I'll be pointing out a lot of things where I could be like, oh, okay, I see why racists would appreciate this. I can see why racists would promote and heavily endorse a book like this. So I'm going to have to make a note to make sure I'm finding some things that I think are constructive since the victim wrote this book. If a white person had written this book, I can only say again, I would be much more aggressive in what I had to say, and I would not feel compelled at all to find anything good to say about this book. I would be perfectly happy to just go through saying whatever I wanted to if a racist had written this book.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
I think the good thing that we have, on our side is that we have a code that we can use to kind of see how we can look at this and kind of compare it to where the level of analysis was at the time. I really can't express the relief that I have at just having enough codification to just be able to see through, you know, the gaps or in the level of analysis that the author had or has, as against what it is like to have a code to look at this through. Counter-racist codification, as I said before, is key. I mean, it's the key. It's the way in and the way out.
I agree. I feel like I have to work on detaching myself from situations because I get really angry, really emotional, and then I just react, and I don't respond in the best way. There have been times where I would just stay calm, and it shocks white people, and I think that's the best way because it's just like not good for your health to like get all upset, and that's what they want. So just to think clearly.
Right.
But it takes time, yeah.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, just on the comment that the female caller just made. That was a part where Ida Mae was called a racial slur. She was called a nigger. And she was asked if she heard what they said about her. And she said she didn't pay them any attention. And at first I was thinking, you know, that may have come from the fact that, you know, it was such a commonplace to be abused at that time and called a racial slur, till it was just commonplace. And then again, you could look at it like, you know, she just ignored it, you know, because, I mean, what could she do anyway? She could protest, but then she could probably end up in a worse predicament. So I was just wondering what the other callers think when she said she didn't pay any attention to that. Was it from just a commonplace, or was she being smart by not paying attention to it?
It could have been both. That was kind of my initial thought. Like, number one, like you were saying about how commonplace it was. We're talking like 1920s? I mean, oof. I would say go back and look at like Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn, where nigger is in there over 200 times. Like, that was said as often as somebody saying good morning or hello at that time. So I'm sure that was somebody calling you nigger was nothing to report. That was not anything special or unusual. A white person calling you nigger was not anything unusual at that particular time. And then I think also to keep in mind, she was responding to a white person. So I think even now, like all of us on this line, even all of us being less confused, 2013, if we were talking to a white person and someone had called us a nigger, I'm sure how we were explaining that or how we would talk about that sort of situation to a racist suspect would sound very different than the way we might talk about the same situation to a non-white person. Particularly if she's a child and she's talking to a grown white woman. I mean, I don't even know how much there is that you could say, particularly at that time. I mean, you could be killed for nothing. So, I mean, it's not like she could say, you know, yeah, I heard that no good cracker. I mean, we should go back. I mean, how much could she really say being a child talking to a grown white person in the 1920s? So I think it could be both, just it being so common and, you know, you don't really have that many options of what you're going to say. I'll mute my line. We did have one person that just added on, the person that dialed in from 2658. If you just joined in, if you want to give your response to that and anything else real quick.
I actually was on earlier and had to leave the line and come back on. What was the question?
Mr. Demery 4, he just asked about the response that Ida Mae had when she was called a nigger, and Miss McLeana, the white woman that she was working with, subject to, when they left, the white woman said, "Did you hear what they called you?" And she responded, Ida Mae, she responded, she said, yeah, but I don't pay it no attention. They call you so many names, I don't pay attention to it. And Mr. Dimmer, he was asking about that response. If that response was the result of nigger being so commonly used, or if she was just trying to give the most codified response, or just what might have motivated that verbal response. Did you have any thoughts on that, or did you have something else you wanted to?
I think the answer it's so commonly used probably is the most popular answer. I can recall reading Malcolm X's autobiography, and this wasn't even the South. This was in I started to say Milwaukee, but it's somewhere up north where Malcolm was born and raised in, and when he went to the foster care, and
Lansing,
he was under
Michigan.
Pardon?
It was Lansing, Michigan.
That's right. And he was under the foster care of white people, and they called him nigger so much. He said he thought that was his name. So I mean, it was a common practice, during that time.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
I kind of wondered about this for a while. You know how they get on Black Americans now for using the N-word and saying that Black people should not use the N-word. And like people were saying it was such common practice as being called nigger or whatever like that. And I listened to like slave narratives, and even the slaves or the kidnapped Africans, I would rather use that word, even the kidnapped Africans, when they were talking about other African Americans, they wouldn't say African American, they would say a nigger gal. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, I hope this ain't off the subject, but it's like the fact that we call each other nigger now. What's the big difference between when we call each other nigger now and nigger back then? Black people have always called each other nigger because that's, like y'all said, it was common practice and being heard so much. That just what, that just what we called each other. And it still is today. Like they used to say even a long time ago, people used to like nigger please and such and such, Does that make sense to anyone, or what? Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
I think. Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yes. I kind of like see a situation where history is kind of like repeating itself. That's why lately white people have been agitating to want to be able to say nigger along with other non-white people who have made it acceptable to do so, and who knows? Next thing you know, the dolls will come back with the big eyes and the lips and whatnot. I'm seeing history repeating itself. I was driving down I-95, and they actually had a non-white victim of racism, white supremacy, that is known by the name of Flavor Flav, and you'd have thought the picture was something back in the early 20th century, with the quote unquote magpie look with the big lips and whatnot, in a big the big poster signs that you see off I-95 or some other expressway. Well, basically what it was advertising him coming into town, something like that, and I see that repeating itself, from that standpoint. Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm. That passage in the book, or I just read it really quick in terms of repeating, because I feel like a lot of times we act like our pitiful non-constructive responses to white terrorism are new. And that's one constructive thing I've seen already in the book, and just seeing how a lot of our non-constructive behavior patterns have just been repeated over and over and over and over for generations, unfortunately. Just going back to, we are going to have to change our behavior. Racist man, racist woman, they are not going to discontinue racism. It's us. We're going to have to change and make massive improvements with regards to what we're doing to put them out of business. But the quick passage, and this is still Ida May, she says, they started up the steps, and as they walked toward the church door, Bebe pulled out a gun and shot at them 6 times, aiming at Irene or her escort or both. He was a bad shot and didn't hit anybody, but it was exciting, and the talk of the woods and further proof to Ida May that Alfonso Banks sure knew how to show a girl a good time, even though he had nothing to do with it. Just that little shot right there sounds very similar to what I hear about our conduct right now, the way we treat each other, just the whole nine. That sounds like you could put that 21st century in it. Yep, all of that. Names, the nicknames, and just every aspect of it with regards to how we treat each other. And we haven't even read 10% of this book yet. Very little, and we have already had 2 examples of random shootings in a black area where this was a good time for somebody. Just going and shooting in a black area randomly, this was a good time. That right there, I see that trend continuing even today, where for fun, that's what a lot of victims of racism, white supremacy have been trained, groomed, brain trashed to do. Going out to terrorize other black people, this is fun. This is exciting. This is a thrill. That's in the word guide, thrilling. Racists have conditioned us to think that many things are thrilling and exciting that are nothing but destructive behaviors that help them keep their foot on our necks. We've done our 3 hours. We will be back tomorrow and Sunday. We have a black female author. She's coming on the program Sunday, Kim Williams. She wrote a book on her terroristic experience in the workplace. She was one of the few black employees and had to deal with racist jokes and all other sorts of tacky behavior from white men and women on her job. She'll be here Sunday evening, the normal time, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Kim Williams, her book was turned into a series. You can watch it on YouTube. It's called The Unwritten Rules. It's based on her book. Many of the vignettes and what have you that they depict are just directly from her book. So you can check that out if you want to get a heads up on what's coming down the road for Sunday. But her name again, Kim Williams, black female. She'll be with us Sunday evening and, of course, doing the compensatory call-in tomorrow. Thanks, everyone, for participating. I hope it was constructive. Anybody have any final sentences they wanted to get in before we wrap things up?
Thank you for having the book session.
For sure. Thank you all for calling in. Great insight. Anything else?
What can we get a handle for the female caller that just spoke? I appreciate her comments this evening.
Kawaba. That's Kawaba.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you. You brought a good perspective this evening.
Thank you.
We're good?
Yeah.
Right on, Kawaba. Second that one. Thank you, everybody, for the participation. If you would like the hard copy of the book to kind of because this is a big book, I'm not going to remember everything. So for me, it's helpful to have the actual book so I can keep my notes from things we talked about this time through and get started next week. If you would like a hard copy of the book so that you can refer as we listen, let me know and I can hook you up. You might need to install, or you will need to install an e-reader, but those are free. So just, pick one that you like and you should be good to go. Just let me know if you would like a copy of the book so you can follow along. We'll be back tomorrow and Sunday. Invest if you think the program is constructive. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. I hope it was a constructive investment of your Friday evening. The term nigger in the woodpile, I had such a chuckle. That was one of the first news stories that I saw today, where some racist got in trouble in Australia. They were sitting down to discuss a $6 billion project, $6 billion project that was supposed to be helping non-white people in Australia. And the white guy gets up in this meeting and says, yeah, we've got this nigger in the woodpile, and he doesn't think anything is wrong, just keeps right on rolling. And someone points out, like, hey, wait, not supposed to be saying that publicly. Plus they had non-white people present too. And now this has become a big deal, and they had to come out and issue all these phony, tacky apologies and what have you. But just that phrase, nigger in a woodpile, some of the people didn't know what it meant. I would say check that. You go back, do a little research, important one to know. Dr. Welsing has talked about that phrase on the program before. You can go back in the archives and hear her explain the etymology of that term according to her, what she knows, her research. But definitely white people's little racist phrases and jokes and just the way that they use words, very, very important. Reveals a ton about the system of white supremacy. Thanks, everyone. It was grand. We will be back next week for the second installment, I hope, constructive session. Does anybody want to do the prayer to wrap things up?
I can do it.
Thank you kindly. No, let us not forget our ancestors. I would again insert the Great Migration. Fantastic. No problem getting more research on that. But I would say that we have had many, 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 many more responses to racism, white supremacy before the Great Migration. Our family has been fighting against racist man, racist woman, racist child for its entire existence. White people have just done a very good job of keeping us poorly informed about their efforts. Take it away, Universal Jones.
Dear Creator and ancestors, please give us non-whites the strength, clarity, and courage to utilize various pathways of codification in combating the system of racism, white supremacy. We are ready, able, and willing to end this terrorism. Aid us in decreasing our anti-blackness. Aid us into understanding that we are all victims in search of solutions. Our condition has been conditioned over decades. Let us replace white supremacy with justice ASAP. It has been time. Ashe.
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 Context of White Supremacy. Signing out. Thank you all for tuning in.
I'm a victim, brother.
You're a victim.
I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my condition.
Mm-hmm.
Even my conditioning has been conditioned.